Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know you watch this video to accompany you to sleep, so if you like this video don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. Lost in the marshland. The woman was terrified, seemingly running for her life. Soon after, she vanished into the night. A peaceful area of rural Long Island began to yield up its terrible secrets. N's marshland runs alongside Long Island's Ocean Parkway, a beautiful albeit desolate stretch of beach highway. It was here, hidden away from the eyes of passing drivers, that a serial killer disposed of his victims. Over the course of almost 20 years, the Long Island serial killer, or the Gilgo Beach Killer, as he was also known, murdered between 10 and 16 people associated with prostitution. The identity of the killer and his motives have perplexed homicide detectives ever since the first discovery of his victims in December 2010, and has led to one of the most infamous, unidentified serial killer cases in recent history. This grim story unfolded on May 1st of that year, when Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old Craigslist escort from New Jersey, vanished. Before her disappearance, Shannon had visited the home of Joseph Brewer, a resident of the upmarket gated community of Oak Beach, who had hired Shannon as his escort for the evening. Brewer would later tell police that, after arriving at his home, Shannon began to act erratically and appeared disoriented before fleeing out into the warm night. She ran straight past her pimp, Michael Pack, who was waiting for her outside in his black Ford Explorer. Several neighbors saw and heard Shannon that night. She ran down the street of expensive houses, pounding on doors and screaming for help. Despite her evident distress, nobody let her in. Instead, they called 911 and watched as she ran away from the Oak Beach gatehouse toward Anchor Way and then onto the bayou, completely out of sight. Exactly who Shannon was running from remains a mystery. At some point during her escape, she managed to call 911 and hollered, "They're trying to kill me." The lost women. 7 months after Shannon disappeared, 4 bodies were found close to one another, nestled among the thorny underbrush running alongside Ocean Parkway on Gilgo Beach. As news of this gruesome find circulated in the media, locals and investigators presumed that one of the bodies would be Shannon Gilbert, as the site was just 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers, from where she was last seen. However, an examination of the remains concluded that none of them was her. They were identified as Amber Lynn Costello, 27, Melissa Barthelemy, 24, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, and Megan Waterman, 22. Just like Shannon, all 4 women had been working as Craigslist escorts when they disappeared. Maureen went missing in July 2007 when she left Norwich, Connecticut for New York City. Melissa vanished in July 2009 after meeting with an escort client. Megan disappeared just a month after Gilbert, having placed a Craigslist advertisement, and Amber vanished in September 2010, after arranging to meet a client who offered her $1,500 for her services. It became clear that these discoveries had unearthed a serial killer's dumping ground, and, in April 2011, an extensive search was finally launched. Airplanes fitted with high-tech photographic equipment scoured the area, while police with horses and dogs explored the undergrowth alongside the highway and beach. The search led to the discovery of 6 more victims approximately 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers, east of the other bodies, 4 more women, a female toddler and an Asian man wearing women's clothing. Of these victims, which were all found within 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, of the first cluster of bodies, only one has ever been identified, 20-year-old Jessica Taylor. She vanished in July 2003, while working as an escort in Manhattan, New York. Shortly after her disappearance, her dismembered torso had been found in Manorville, New York, around 40 miles, 64.4 kilometers, east of Gilgo Beach. Her skull, hands, and a forearm were subsequently discovered during the search of Gilgo Beach itself. The remains of another victim, known only as Jane Doe 6, were also found at Manorville and Gilgo Beach. While the police were unable to identify the remains, forensic experts did determine that none belonged to Shannan Gilbert. What happened to Shannan? In early December 2011, an extended search turned up Shannan Gilbert's purse, cell phone, lip gloss, jeans, and shoes in a marsh near Oak Beach, several miles to the east of the second group of bodies. Following the discovery, the search for Shannan intensified, with the outcome looking decidedly bleak. Dozens of officers using machetes and a bulldozer were called to the scene. December 13, 2011. The remains of Shannan Gilbert are found in a shallow marsh near Oak Beach, the place where she was last seen alive. The authorities soon announced that they believed Gilbert had drowned in the marsh and that her death was not connected to the other murders, despite the fact that she was found in the same vicinity and fit the victim profile. Her family was furious with this conclusion and lambasted this premature and inconsiderate theory. 2. In fact, before Gilbert's body was even found, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer publicly announced that he believed Gilbert had wandered off and accidentally drowned. "I think Dormer just wants to find the remains, say she drowned, and close the case before he retires," fumed Mari Gilbert, Shannan's mother. The investigation also drew criticism from some of the victims' families, who accused officers of incompetence and inaction. Some even hired their own private investigators. Shannan's family hired Michael Baden, a forensic pathologist, in order to obtain a second opinion on her autopsy. According to Baden, there was no evidence that Shannan had died of natural causes, a drug overdose, or, as Suffolk County Police believed, by drowning. He observed that there was insufficient information to determine a definite cause of death, but found that the hyoid bone in Shannan's neck was deformed, which could have been caused by strangulation. 3. These structures, the larynx, and the hyoid bone, are often fractured during homicidal manual strangulation. Michael Baden. Since the discovery of the bodies, plenty of theories have abounded. Some have speculated that the killer was a seasonal worker, a drifter, or a fisherman from Freeport. More lurid theories have also been put forward that the killer was making snuff films or belonged to a satanic cult. Another hypothesis involved a local businessman who committed suicide days after Shannan's remains were found. Police were quick to deny that he was a suspect. He was merely a victim of rumors and hearsay. Untraceable calls. One of the more likely theories was that the killer was a police officer or ex-police officer with extensive knowledge of law enforcement techniques. Following Melissa Barthelomy's disappearance, the Long Island serial killer made taunting phone calls to her 16-year-old sister, Amanda. He called Melissa a whore and asked if Amanda knew what Melissa was doing. These calls were always placed from crowded areas, such as New York's Penn Station and Madison Square Garden, where it would have been next to impossible for surveillance cameras to single out the caller from the crowd. Moreover, the caller only stayed on the line for under 3 minutes, indicating that he knew it took from 3 to 5 minutes to successfully trace a phone call. Police were convinced that these calls came from the killer, as opposed to a prankster, leading many to believe that the murderer must have been a member of a law enforcement agency at some point in his life. Amid the investigation into the murders, Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke resigned, adding fuel to the rogue cop theory. Following his James Burke resigned, adding fuel to the rogue cop theory. Following his resignation, Burke was arrested for a 2012 assault on Christopher Loeb, who had stolen a duffel bag filled with pornography and sex toys from Burke's car. After Burke's arrest, an escort came forward to claim that he was into rough sex. She alleged that Burke had attempted to strangle her during a party in Oak Beach, the gated community where Gilbert was last seen alive. It then transpired that Burke had stymied an FBI investigation into the Long Island murders and had intentionally kept them out of the loop. What was he afraid of the FBI finding? In 2016, an attorney for Shannon Gilbert's family alleged that there could be a connection between Burke and the murders. However, he was never charged. The lying doctor. Another suspect in the slayings was Dr. Peter Hackett, a physician and neighbor of Joseph Brewer, one of the last people to see Shannon alive. Dr. Hackett lived in close proximity to the marshland where Shannon Gilbert's remains would later be found. According to Shannon's mother, Mari Gilbert, Dr. Hackett had called her the day after her daughter went missing and told her that he was a doctor who ran a home for wayward girls. Several days later, Dr. Hackett denied he had ever made this call. Phone records, however, confirmed that he had called Mari Gilbert twice following Shannon's disappearance. In 2012, Shannon's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Dr. Hackett, in which they alleged that he could have prevented her death. Dr. Hackett told Mari Gilbert that he ran a home for wayward girls, and that Shannon was in his care, said John Ray, an attorney for the Gilbert family. Why would anyone do something like that? For Dr. Hackett was eventually ruled out as a suspect by Suffolk County Police. Joseph Brewer also fell under a cloud of suspicion, since Shannon was last spotted fleeing from his home in a state of panic. However, he, too, was quickly ruled out as a suspect when Suffolk County Police could find no evidence to tie him to any of the murders. Investigator theories. For years, law enforcement remained tight-lipped on the notorious Long Island serial killer, but in 2017, the silence was at last broken. Suffolk County Assistant District Attorney Robert Biancavilla named a new suspect, John Bitrolf, a carpenter who had recently been charged with 25 years to life sentences for beating 2 sex workers to death in 1993 and 1994. Bitrolf lived in the hamlet of Manorville, where the torsos of 2 of the Long Island serial killer's victims were discovered. Biancavilla alleged that some aspects of the evidence found over the years at Ocean Parkway were similar to the earlier crimes attributed to Bitrolf. Evidence found at the crime scenes, however, did not match any found at earlier crime scenes. It was thus impossible to conclusively link Bitrolf to the murders. A hypothetical profile of the killer was created by Jim Clemente, a criminal profiler, Scott Bond, an assistant professor of sociology at Drew University, and former Nassau County Assistant District Attorney Fred Klein. they deduced that the killer was likely a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s, he was married or had a girlfriend, he was intelligent and articulate, he had a decent job that gave him access to burlap sacks, and he lived or once lived near Ocean Parkway. A final suspect for at least some of the murders attributed to the Long Island killer is convicted serial killer Joel Ripken. Between the years of 1989 and 1993, he murdered at least 9 women in New York and Long Island, disposing some of their bodies in the same general area as the Long Island serial killer. However, in an interview, Ripken denied that any of the victims were his. He stated that he dumped his victims hundreds of miles apart and not in the same location, something he called the Long Island serial killer's sloppy foredoing. 5. Telling the story. On that fateful night of May 1, 2010, Shannon Gilbert drove past the remote marshland where 10 victims of the Long Island serial killer lay, while en route to an escort call. Unknown to her at the time, the disturbing and mysterious events that would unfold over the forthcoming hours would forever link her to those bodies and spark one of the most extensive murder investigations in Long Island history. Numerous newspapers and magazines, a best-selling book, Lost Girls, an unsolved American mystery by Robert Coker. 6 and an episode in the television documentary series The Killing Season have all told the story of the 10 bodies discovered along the Ocean Parkway. Despite the extensive media coverage, the case still remains unsolved and open. Case notes. Shannon's behavior led many to believe that she was on drugs or experiencing some kind of psychotic episode. No one knows who Shannon was referring to when she cried out that someone was trying to kill her. The 4 bodies were found wrapped in burlap sacks. In an effort to help capture the killer, an online petition asked authorities to grant immunity to sex workers who came forward with information. The toddler was between 16 and 24 months old and was a non-Caucasian. Jane Doe number 6 was thought to have been around 5 feet 2 in, 1.57 meters, tall and between 18 and 35 years old. On the 5th anniversary of the discovery of the first set of remains, it was announced that the FBI would join in on the investigation. In 2016, Shannon's mother, Mari Gilbert, was stabbed to death by her 27-year-old daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Gilbert, who was suffering from schizophrenia. A wrongful death lawsuit is brought by representatives of the deceased's estate. It seeks compensation from the person held to be legally at fault for the deceased's death. John Bitt Rolfe was identified as the killer of Rita Tangredet and Colleen McNamee after his brother was arrested for violating a protective order and his DNA was entered into the state database. Forensic scientists at the Suffolk County Crime Lab determined that the DNA came from a blood relative of the perpetrator of the 2 murders. There are currently 6 more murder cases being reviewed by police in an attempt to link them to the Long Island serial killer. Story 2. The murder of Kathleen Peterson, 2001. Staircase of death. A brutal murder? A tragic accident? A bizarre bird strike? The mysterious fate of successful businesswoman Kathleen Peterson whipped up a storm of bitter controversy and wild theorizing that has never abated. Oh, the outside world, the Petersons had everything: a beautiful home, a loving marriage, and successful careers. Kathleen Peterson earned a 6-figure salary with a telecommunications company. Her husband, Michael, was a full-time novelist. This idyllic image was shattered when, in December 2001, Kathleen was found dead at the bottom of a now infamous staircase in the couple's North Carolina home. The investigation that followed uncovered lies, adultery and financial woes and another death at the bottom of a different staircase. It all led to Michael's eventual conviction, but some believe there's an altogether different explanation for Kathleen's death. Kathleen, 48, and Michael, 58, had both been married before when they met in the mid-1980s. Their meeting was facilitated by their children, who were friends. Kathleen had a teenage daughter named Caitlin. Michael had two sons, Clayton and Todd, from his first marriage, as well as two adopted daughters, named Margaret and Martha. In 1992, this Brady Bunch-style family moved into a sprawling home on Cedar Street in Durham, North Carolina. 5 years later, Michael and Kathleen exchanged vows, making their union official. Caitlin described them as the most ideal parents. After moving into the Cedar Street home, Michael started writing columns on city politics for the local newspaper, the Herald Sun. His increased public profile prompted him to run for mayor, a bid that ended badly following revelations that he had exaggerated his military record. He had claimed he was awarded a Purple Heart after being wounded by shrapnel in Vietnam. In reality, he was awarded the medal after he had been hurt in a car accident. Despite this embarrassment, Michael still hoped to enter the political arena. In 2001, a few months before Kathleen's death, he ran for city council, but again, lost. When officials moved so quickly to charge him with his wife's murder, he wondered if local politics had something to do with it. A desperate husband. In the early hours of December 9, 2001, Michael frantically called 911. "My wife had an accident. She's still breathing," he cried. "She fell down the stairs. She's still breathing, please come." 2 police and medics arrived, but the scene was not as they expected. Michael had said he spent 3 hours by the pool that night. Yet, although the temperature outside was only around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 12.7 degrees Celsius, all he was wearing were shorts and a t-shirt. Kathleen was lying in a pool of blood at the foot of the stairs. Blood spatter climbed the walls and reached the ceiling. Then came the autopsy findings. Kathleen's head had been sliced open in places. The medical examiner determined that she had died as the result of a beating, not a fall down the stairs. December 11, 2001 / Michael Peterson is charged with his wife Kathleen's murder. Michael insisted he was innocent. He said that he and Kathleen had been drinking, and that she had also taken a Valium. He could only surmise that the combination of the drug with alcohol made her unsteady on her flip-flop clad feet, causing her to tumble down the wooden staircase. "I've whispered her name more than 1,000 times, and I can't stop crying. I would have never done anything to hurt her," Michael told reporters outside the Durham County Jail. 3. Prosecutors didn't buy it. While they did find alcohol in Kathleen's system, the blood alcohol content was only 0.07% below the legal limit to drive in North Carolina. Investigators learned that she had suffered from headaches and dizziness for weeks before her fall and had even lost her vision for a half hour at one point. Nevertheless, they claimed to have found too much evidence that pointed to Michael as the culprit, including another dead body. Look to the past. 16 years before Kathleen was found dead, a 43-year-old woman named Elizabeth Ratliff died in similar fashion. Ratliff was an American working as a teacher at an airbase near Frankfurt, Germany. She was also a friend of Michael's, who lived in Germany for a spell with his first wife and 2 sons. On November 25, 1985, Ratliff died after falling down the stairs. As in Kathleen's case, there was a lot of blood at the scene. The blood was all the way up the staircase, said her friend, Cheryl Appel Schumacher, who later helped to clean up. For the authorities had accepted that the death was an accident and that Elizabeth had suffered a brain hemorrhage while climbing the stairs. Michael helped to organize Elizabeth's funeral and subsequently adopted her daughters. When North Carolina prosecutors heard of Michael's proximity to another staircase-related death, they announced that the similarities were too many to be coincidental. Here I have two cases. Two women that appeared to die the same way. Two women that are associated with Michael Peterson. Lightning don't strike the same place twice, Detective Art Holland told a television reporter. 5. Elizabeth's body was exhumed in Texas, and a medical examiner from North Carolina performed a new autopsy. Her verdict: Elizabeth had been beaten to death and the German authorities had overlooked the evidence. Jim Harden, the district attorney who prosecuted Peterson, did a great deal of research into the suspect, a lot of which was severely damning. The couple had $143,000 in credit card debt, nearly equal Kathleen's annual salary. In addition, Kathleen was insured for $1.40 million, which Michael would pocket if her death were accidental. 6. Harden presented a compelling argument that this sum would solve Michael's financial problems and allow him to continue to live the affluent, privileged life to which he had been accustomed. 7. From what we've found, every aspect of Mike Peterson's life is a lie. Jim Harden. However, there was another revelation that prosecutors proffered as the most likely murder motive. Michael had been emailing men to solicit sex and had a cache of gay pornography on his computer. Michael had been emailing a man named Brent Walgamot for sex. Walgamot testified that he had exchanged about 20 emails with Michael and talked to him on the phone between August 30th and September 5th, 2001. He had planned to meet Michael for a rendezvous, but he stood Michael up and never heard from him again. Walgamot testified that Michael made it clear he was committed to his wife. If it's an idyllic relationship in this marriage, why is he emailing somebody else to meet for sexual relations outside of marriage? Asked Assistant District Attorney David Sox. 9. He suggested that Kathleen could have found the pornographic photos or the sex-soliciting emails on Michael's computer and confronted him, which would have been a clear motive for Michael to murder her. Blood and the blowpoke. Harden pointed to the abundance of blood at the scene as proof Michael was lying about Kathleen's fate. During the 2003 trial, the prosecutor called to testify Dwayne Deaver, a State Bureau of Identification, SBI agent deemed by Judge Orlando Hudson to be an expert in blood spatter evidence. Deaver told jurors that he had conducted a series of experiments that pointed away from Kathleen having accidentally fallen and toward a beating. Michael's lawyers presented their own blood spatter expert. Dr. Henry Lee asserted that the blood in the stairwell was, in fact, consistent with the fall. Once Kathleen hit her head, she could have coughed up blood while dazed and staggering. Lee went even further by insisting the amount of blood precluded a beating. No murder weapon was found at the scene, but prosecutors offered one anyway. Kathleen's sister Candace had given her a fireplace blow poke as a Christmas gift in 1984. According to pathologist Dr. Deborah Radis, the 40-inch, 101.6 centimeters, brass tool was the perfect instrument for inflicting the lacerations found on Kathleen's scalp. The blowpoke was found covered with dead bugs and cobwebs in a garage during the trial. Hardin questioned a detective who had searched the garage, subtly suggesting that the blowpoke had been planted there. The fight goes on. On October 10, 2003, jurors sided with the prosecution. Michael was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His adopted daughters, whose mother's death had been used to prove Michael's guilt, sobbed in the courtroom, certain of his innocence. Kathleen's family, including her daughter Caitlin, who had split with her siblings by marriage in believing Michael guilty, applauded the conviction. Michael's lawyers kept fighting. Throughout the investigation, they had cooperated with the film crew who produced The Staircase, a groundbreaking French television documentary that generated worldwide interest in Michael's case. 2 days after the conviction, they started the appeal process, arguing that evidence connected with Elizabeth's death never should have been admitted. They challenged Deaver's testimony and qualifications, arguing that he had exaggerated his credentials during the trial. Their objections fell on deaf ears until 2011, when the agent was fired from the SBI for failing to report blood test results that helped lead to the wrongful murder conviction of an innocent man named Greg Taylor, who spent almost 17 years in prison. Paulette Sutton, a nationally recognized expert in blood pattern analysis, testified that Deaver's methods were antiquated and unscientific. According to an Associated Press story, she chuckled as she watched videos of Deaver beating a styrofoam head and blood-soaked sponge in an attempt to recreate the blood splatters found on Peterson's shoes and in the stairwell. Sutton's testimony helped overturn Michael's conviction, and in 2011, Judge Hudson ruled that Deaver had misled jurors and that Michael would get a new trial. Michael spent 8 years in prison proclaiming his innocence, but prosecutors still insisted on his guilt. In 2017, facing the prospect of a trial at 73 years old, Michael entered an Alford plea to a manslaughter charge. The plea is treated as a guilty plea for sentencing purposes, but Michael received less than the 8 years he had already served. This meant he could walk away a free man. Michael said that taking the Alford plea was the most difficult thing he had ever done, but he believed police and prosecutors would do anything to convict me. And I am not going to put my life and my freedom in their hands. 10 prosecutors considered the plea a win. Durham District Attorney Roger Eccles stated, "It has always been, and remains today, the state's position that Michael Peterson is responsible for the death of Kathleen Peterson." 11. Owl attack. The Staircase documentary unwittingly recruited armchair detectives worldwide to proffer theories explaining what could have happened to Kathleen that night. Most are split between the two scenarios presented at trial, that either Michael killed his wife, or she fell in a manner that caused multiple injuries to her head. However, the most intriguing theory suggests the case is more a whodunit than a whodunit. In 2003, Larry Pollard, a friend of Michael's, asked prosecutors to reopen the case because of information that pointed to another culprit altogether, an owl. Looking at autopsy photos, Pollard said that some of the gashes on Kathleen's body looked like marks from an owl's exceptionally sharp talons. Pollard consulted with ornithological experts who agreed that the pattern and shape of the cuts on Kathleen's head looked far more like an owl attack than a fireplace tool. Hardin dismissed this theory as being completely ridiculous, but owl attacks are not as outlandish as they might seem. Kate Davis, executive director of a wild bird education organization in Florence, Italy, said, "Raptors are known to get aggressive when defending their nests and Hatchlings. They tend to attack at night. Michael's phone call to 911 was at 2:40 a.m. Kathleen was holding clumps of her own hair, mixed with wood splinters and needles from a cedar tree. Could an owl have become entangled in her hair? When the SBI eventually acknowledged finding a microscopic feather on a clump of hair in Kathleen's hand, Pollard shouted, "The feather has been found." 12 With Michael's plea agreement, however, the owl theory will never have its day in court. Michael himself said he has run out of theories. "The only thing I know absolutely, positively, is that I had nothing to do with Kathleen's death." Case notes. The Petersons' house was 10,000 square foot, 3,048 square m, had 14 rooms, and was white with black shutters. The Purple Heart is a decoration reserved for military personnel injured or killed in action. There appeared to be a shoe print and blood on the back of Kathleen's sweatshirt. Michael was barefoot when police arrived. His sneakers and socks were found next to Kathleen's body. There was a drop of blood on the inside of Michael's shorts. Kathleen was wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt, appropriate clothing for the outside temperature. Michael said that he and Kathleen had been drinking champagne to celebrate a possible movie deal for one of his novels. Michael claimed to have been relaxing by the pool, too far away to hear any screams from the house. The prosecution suggested that the death of his friend Elizabeth Ratliff had given Michael the idea of how to murder his own wife and get away with it. Kathleen had confided in her sister, Candace, that her company's stock was in free fall, and that she had lost $1 million on paper. Walgamot said he charged men $150 an hour to do anything under the sun. 8. State computer experts determined that someone had deleted hundreds of gay pornography files in the days leading up to Kathleen's death and the day after she died. Dr. Henry Lee had been the medical examiner in the infamous O.J. Simpson case. Dr. Lee theorized that Kathleen's coughs could have propelled blood spatter up the stairwell walls. Forensic tests ruled out the blowpoke as the murder weapon. No other murder weapon has been suggested. Caitlin and her father were awarded the $1.4 million life insurance policy for which Michael had been the beneficiary. The documentary series The Staircase was directed by Oscar winner Jean-Xavier de Lestrade. It won a prestigious Peabody Award in 2005. An audit found that, over Deaver's 25-year career, he had falsified evidence in 34 separate cases. The Alford plea allowed Michael to maintain his innocence while acknowledging that there was enough evidence to convict him of the charge. Some thought that Kathleen may have interrupted an intruder, who pummeled her before fleeing. The species of owl put forward as Kathleen's potential attacker is a barred owl. An adult weighs 1.6 pounds, 725 g, with a wingspan up to 44 inches, 112 centimeters. Kathleen may have been attacked by the owl outside and then staggered in and collapsed at the foot of the stairs. In 2007, Caitlin and Michael reached a $25 million settlement in a wrongful death suit. Caitlin said this ensured that Michael couldn't write a book about the case and pocket the profit. Story 3. After 2 decades undercover, she's ready to tell the real story of human trafficking. For years, former FBI Special Agent Nikki Badolato led the FBI's Child Exploitation Task Force targeting some of the most heinous criminals. Now she wants Americans to know the truth about underage sex crimes. On an August night in 2003, a young woman who went by the name Paulina sank into the sofa of her modest, rented apartment, opened up her laptop, and began talking about sex with a man she'd recently met in a Yahoo chat group. His name was Stephen Boland. His first communications had been terse, but he soon warmed to Paulina. It didn't take long for both of them to begin to open up. Paulina had told Boland she lived in the Atlanta area, that she had a 3-year-old daughter, that her daughter's father was no longer in the picture. Soon, she was sharing more intimate details, what it was like growing up a skinny white girl in a rough neighborhood outside of D.C., how her dad, a Marine, had died by suicide 2 weeks before she was born, how her mom had been emotionally and physically abusive, and had never really shown her love. How she'd had a sexual relationship with her stepfather. Paulina would put her daughter to bed and then she and Boland would chat throughout the night, over Yahoo, and sometimes on the phone. The back and forth could feel like dating, but with an added element of danger and risk. Both Paulina and Boland knew they were tiptoeing up to a line to see if they trusted each other enough to cross it. It could take a while to figure that out. Eventually, Boland asked Paulina to send pictures of her daughter, and she agreed to do so, though the ones she'd shared were chased the little girl clothed and her face turned away from the camera or obscured behind an untamable halo of blonde curls. After seeing the pictures, Boland asked to meet. While a lot of the men Paulina had encountered in chat rooms like Sex with Younger just wanted to trade images and videos of children, to expand their illicit collections, Boland was a traveler, someone looking to act upon his obsessions. On September 17, just as they'd arranged, Paulina sat on a bench outside Perimeter Mall with a stroller parked in front of her, scanning the parking lot nervously. Part of her hoped Boland wouldn't show. When he did, she could see he was handsome, a preppy guy in a pink polo shirt and khakis. "Paulina?" he asked eagerly. She nodded. As he smiled and pulled back the blanket draped across the stroller, he found himself surrounded, handcuffs slipped around his wrists. Paulina watched his face fall, his confusion giving way to distress as FBI agents took him into custody. It was her first undercover arrest. It would be the first of many. If one wanted to hide in plain sight, one could do no better than the tidy, suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of St. Louis, where FBI Special Agent Nikki Badolato now resides. The well-tended, 2-story homes are so pleasantly indistinct that I could hardly tell you what hers looks like, even if it were safe for me to do so, which it is not. Suffice to say that Midwestern comfort and conformity unspool around every gently winding curve. Here Badolato has raised her 2 children, a daughter who is now in college and a son who is a junior at a local high school. When planning a neighborhood scavenger hunt or tending the community garden, Badolato does not often mention her many years as head of the Child Exploitation Task Force, a joint effort between the feds and local law enforcement that targets some of the country's most heinous crimes. Open a cabinet in her kitchen, however, and a government-issued Glock 42 can be found stowed away between the vitamins and mixing bowls. On a sunny morning this past October, Badolato sat at her dining room table, scrapbooks and albums spread out before her on the dark wood. There was the acceptance letter she'd received from the bureau the spring of her senior year of high school, after a representative had shown up to administer a test in the typewriting room. "I chose to wear a red dress and red heels," she says of her first day as an FBI mail clerk, 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. "I don't know what the hell I was thinking. I guess maybe I was trying to go in bold." She pauses at a picture of herself on the gun range at Quantico almost 10 years later, her shoulders squared and her caramel hair pulled back into a ponytail as she fires off rounds. By then, she'd married a man she met just after high school, had a little girl, completed college at night, and been accepted into agent training in the heady days after September 11th. She'd seen her first dead body only a few weeks into the job, after the pursuit of a bank robber ended with a shootout in a Walmart. When Badolato got to the scene, the body was still warm, and the perp's head was resting on a bag of cookies. "It was surreal," she says. "How many times have you been in a Walmart and walked down aisle 4, not really expecting there to be a dead person with his head lying on a bag of Chips Ahoy?" Badolato wasn't deterred. She felt like the bureau saved her, plucked her out of a shitty home life, and gave her prospects and purpose. As a new agent, she was intent on proving herself worthy. My training agent told me, you know, Nikki, it's a marathon, not a sprint, she says. I was like, that's ridiculous. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. She turned a few pages to show a picture of the 391 kilos of cocaine and 140 pounds of meth she'd recovered on a single raid during a stint with the cartel squad, then pointed out another in which she poses with a 5-year-old child she'd rescued, the little girl's hair cut short because the kidnapper had wanted her to look like a boy. But the keepsake she really wants to find is the card that Boland's wife had pressed into her hand at his sentencing, the one with the picture of their children, a blonde girl of about 3 years and a tiny baby, and the words, "These are the faces of the children you protect each day." Boland's wife had been the only one she'd ever encountered who had lobbied for her husband to receive the maximum sentence. Some wives accused the FBI of planting evidence inside computers. Most seemed intent on clinging to their delusions. Attempts to reach Boland for comment were unsuccessful. Which, Badolato has come to understand, is the way it goes with child trafficking and sexual abuse. She had invited me into her home, had agreed to speak on the record about her decades-long career working undercover, because when it comes to the crimes she's spent her career fighting, she has had enough of the delusions people are under. She's had enough of the way movies like Sound of Freedom both glamorize and trivialize the work she and her colleagues do, enough of the idea that swashbuckling white men burst through doors and rescue trafficked children with a Bible in one hand and a firearm in the other, enough of conspiracy theories about Hollywood and Washington that detract from the real root causes of why children are trafficked and abused. Human trafficking is not the movie Pretty Woman, the girl doesn't get the guy, and it's not the movie Taken, where people are kidnapped in a foreign country and sold on the black market, or shipped in a container across the world, one of the detectives who worked on Badolato's task force tells me. I'm not saying that doesn't ever happen, but it's not what we're seeing. Right now some little girl is being dropped off in the parking lot of a motel, Badolato says. There are 4 girls holed up in a hotel next to a McDonald's. It is happening all the time. What they are seeing is a lot more insidious and a lot more homegrown. A report released in 2018 by the State Department ranked the U.S. as one of the worst countries in the world for human trafficking. While the Department of Justice has estimated that between 14,500 and 17,500 foreign nationals are trafficked into this country every year, this number pales in comparison to the number of American minors who are trafficked within it. A 2009 Department of Health and Human Services review of human trafficking into and within the United States found that roughly 199,000 American minors are sexually exploited each year, and that between 244,000 and 325,000 American youths are considered to be at risk of being trafficked, specifically in the sex industry. Heartbreakingly, many of these children are victimized not by strangers who've abducted them from mall parking lots but rather by people they know and trust. Studies have found that as much as 44% of victims are trafficked by family members, most often parents, and not infrequently parents who were trafficked themselves. Between 2011 and 2020, there was an 84% increase in the number of people prosecuted for a federal human trafficking offense. Of the defendants charged in 2020, 92% were male, 63% were white, 66% had no prior convictions, and 95% were U.S. citizens. Badolato started her career as an FBI agent in some of the earliest days that children could be bought, sold, and traded online. As the internet porn industry mushroomed, its most lucrative branch turned out to be that of child sexual abuse materials. The term child pornography is no longer used by those in the field, as it implies consent. And as demand for these images increased, so did the abuse that led to their creation. In 2003, just a few months after Badolato graduated from Quantico, a Crimes Against Children squad was formed in the Atlanta office where she'd been stationed. By then, the FBI was starting to get a handle on the extent of the problem, if not exactly what to do about it. At a week-long training in Baltimore, Badolato was given a tour of the darkest underbelly of fetish chat groups and then instructed to figure out how to infiltrate. Everyone was a little nervous, she explains of the directive. It was a process, a direction that was new. Agents were told that they would need to come up with a persona and a story, and that they would likely have to provide images of children to prove they had a minor on offer. They were also told that they could use images of their own children, if they were comfortable doing so. The FBI no longer endorses this policy. Badolato developed Paulina based on her understanding that any persona would need to share most of her own backstory and traits. That's the only way you can really do undercover work, Badolato says. People can tell the sincerity in what you're saying, so there has to be a level of genuineness, but then you just add this criminal element to it. Most of the things Badolato had told Bolan were true: where she was from, her family background, the monstrousness of her mother, a woman who she says would pass out cigarettes and beers to Badolato's 13-year-old friends in a state of manic permissiveness one minute and fly into a violent rage about a piece of lint on the floor the next. Badolato's mother declined to comment for this article, but a childhood friend corroborated Badolato's account. It was true that growing up in an unstable home with a string of stepdads, she had never really felt loved. True that she had divorced her first husband, true that she was raising their 3-year-old daughter on her own. The only thing that wasn't true was her tale of being molested, her initiation into the lifestyle, to use the chat room parlance that Paulina said she now wanted for her daughter. As Badolato had familiarized herself with the language and behaviors of the chat rooms, she'd honed that added criminal element, imagining what psychological conditions might believably lead a parent to traffic their own child and how those conditions could be grafted onto her real-life story. She already had a history of abuse. It was not hard to extrapolate to a fictional stepfather who had seemed to provide a gentle counterpoint, showing her love and making her feel special when no one else had, even if others couldn't understand. From there, it was easy to convince the chat room participants that she shared their belief or justification that most people had it all wrong and that child love was natural, and could even be beneficial for the child. Badolato estimates that she has arrested more than 1,000 people. Not one of those arrests has failed to end in a conviction. She didn't know until she was in the thick of it that most agents refuse this sort of work, that most can't even pretend to forge a relationship with someone looking to victimize a child. But she could. Paulina, she points out, is not a name she chose at random. It's similar to her own mother's name. Badolato says she had grown up learning to compartmentalize for the sake of her own emotional survival. She'd perfected the art of engaging with someone whose actions she couldn't stand. Doing this work had felt like a way of taking her trauma and putting it to good use, of leveraging her past as a safeguard against her daughter's and other children's futures. Of course, there were moments that were hard to take when suspects mentioned which brands of lubrication were best or whether or not a parent might hold a child down. There were times when she knew that even talking about these things was a turn-on for these men, times when the conversations made her nauseous, times when she'd lie awake all night or play back a recording and think, "Holy shit, I listened to this. I said these words." But she kept faith in the mission. She reminded herself that the pictures she sent of her daughter, the beautiful, little girl sleeping in the next room, did not represent a real child on offer. "I was thinking, if I send this obscure picture of my daughter and he acts on it, then he's never going to harm my daughter or anybody else's," Badolato says now. "I was presenting a fake girl to save a real one." Kyle Park seemed to think he could get away with anything. He seemed to think, for instance, that he could get away with running a brothel, a 1 to 900 sex line, and a house cleaning company out of the same Columbus, Ohio, office park, and under the same oxymoronic name, X-Rec and Hygiene Services. He seemed to think he could invite one young woman and 5 teenagers, 4 of whom he had only just met, on a road trip to Florida, but instead deposit them in 2 rooms of a Red Roof Inn in St. Charles, Missouri. When they piled out of the minivan high on the drugs he'd given them, saw snow falling, and asked to be taken home, he thought he could make a little money off them first. All it took was a few ads in Backpage, the Craigslist of sex advertisements, and men began showing up. Even after things started going south for him, Parks couldn't fathom that he wouldn't prevail. When someone alerted law enforcement as to what was going on, Parks, who, according to legal documents, had been out getting food when the police showed up, burst into the precinct the next morning looking to bail his friend out. When questioned about the 88 condoms found in the back of his van, he said they had been prescribed to him by a doctor. After being taken into custody, he protested that he was being set up. Most people would have cut their losses and pleaded guilty, but not Parks. He thought he could take his case to court and win. And it wasn't impossible to imagine that he might. Badolato knew that even the tightest cases could go sideways when put before 12 people who would inevitably enter the courtroom with a cinematic sense of what sex trafficking was supposed to be. In fact, it wasn't just the jury that Badolato knew she would need to convince, it was also often the victims themselves, young people who had internalized the exact same misconceptions about trafficking that the jury had, along with any number of other judgments society had thrown their way, and who were loath to submit themselves to a courtroom full of more judgment. Of all of Parks' underage victims, the hardest to pin down had been a 17-year-old we'll call Sierra. Once she returned to Columbus, Sierra seemed to basically disappear. Calls to her mother's number went unanswered. When one of the other victims managed to track her down in December 2016, a month before the case was to go to trial, Sierra agreed to meet Badolato on a blighted Columbus block with a string of dilapidated homes, climbing into the bureau's Chevy Malibu with matted hair, dirty clothes, and a wary expression. By this time, Badolato had remarried, had a second child, relocated to St. Louis, and taken over as head of the Child Exploitation Joint Task Force, which had become one of the most productive FBI teams in the country in terms of arrests and convictions. Meanwhile, as the internet streamlined the process of buying or selling any good or service, trafficking had become one of the fastest growing criminal enterprises, estimated by the Department of Homeland Security to bring in $150 billion globally, and considered by many criminals to be a superior business model. If caught, the sentences were often lighter than those for peddling drugs, and unlike crack or heroin, the same product could be used again and again and again. Badolato taught her team of 20 how to do the online undercover work she'd trailblazed in Atlanta, tracking the movements of child abuse material through the online underworld and then prosecuting those who distributed and produced it. Her new squad also initiated her in the type of undercover work it had been doing before her arrival, covert sting operations in which a detective would pose as a John, set up a date, and then meet said date in a hotel room fitted out with hidden recording devices while, in the next room over, a task force team listened in, waiting for the code word that would let them know that enough evidence had been gathered for them to swoop in and shut the op down. This had proved a very effective technique for getting convictions, but Badolato's arrival coincided with both a growing sentiment that consensual sex work had been overcriminalized and an increasing awareness that what looked like consensual sex work might actually be trafficking, no matter what the date professed in that hotel room. Badolato has a tendency to say aloud the things she notices about you, about others, about situations, observations that are not at all unkind but are perceptive enough that most people would keep them to themselves. She points out when someone deflects, and she has a sharp eye for defense mechanisms. She once casually mentions my tendency to mirror other people's vocal and speech patterns. She is not shy about bringing up the emotional and physical abuse she says she experienced as a child, and she is quick to comment when someone is making excuses for someone else's behavior. It was soon clear to her colleagues that Badolato brought a trauma-informed mentality to the work, a tendency to look beyond what someone was doing and instead try to parse why they were doing it. And she was relentless. While some squads did 1 or 2 trafficking sting ops a year, her team was doing 4 or 5 a month. In addition to the hotel rooms reserved for the John and the team, they would have a social worker set up in a third room, ready to offer services to the victims. They would have lookouts stationed to see who might be dropping the date off. If that date was found to be underage, the case was automatically classified as trafficking. But even if they weren't, Badolato's team was primed to get to the bottom of what was going on, to figure out whether they were being manipulated or coerced, and by whom. If I could put my hands on a pimp, that's what I wanted, says Jeff Roediger, a St. Louis County detective who was the John for many of Badolato's sting ops and who makes clear that the team was not interested in policing voluntary sex work. When I had those types of cases, and I knew they were being sincere with me, I wouldn't book them, he says. It was all about talking to the girls. It's not like in the movies where they come running to you. You know, thanks, you rescued me. It's not like that. A lot of them try to bullshit you at first, that's my boyfriend, blah blah blah, but once I talked to them for a while, they would become more forthcoming. Badolato's unit was one of the first in the country to take on this progressive and proactive approach, as she puts it. Soon, St. Louis looked like a sex trafficking capital, not because it was actually trafficking more victims than other cities, but because the task force was so aggressively pursuing those cases, and classifying them as what they were. I mean, I was working in Vice for years, says Roediger. Back in the day, it was always prostitution, prostitution, prostitution until we started to figure it out a little bit, until we started digging a little deeper. Once they did, the task force found that roughly a third of the sex trafficking victims they recovered were under the age of 17, and they began to see the reach of the problem. Kids were being trafficked out of every hotel in the area, from the seediest Roach Motel to the fanciest Ritz-Carlton. They were being trafficked every time of day and by every socio-economic group. Before you go do brain surgery, you got to bust a nut real quick, one underage victim told Badolato of her high-end clientele. Some of the victims were girls. Some were boys. Some were LGBTQ kids who'd been kicked out of their homes. Some were straight cis kids from the suburbs. I tell people that I could probably name 2 or 3 kids in the school district they live in that have been trafficked, Roediger says. And they just can't comprehend it. There were kids who were about to age out of foster care, a particularly at-risk group, according to those who work in the field, kids who'd run away, kids who were being sold to pay their family's rent, or to buy their family members' drugs. There were kids who'd sit in the hotel room, backpack at their feet, dutifully working on their math homework while agents and social workers tried to figure out what to do with them. Was their home life safe enough that they could be returned to it? Would a residential program take them? Of all the imperfect options, which would make them least likely to be trafficked again? The one common denominator was this: they all had a vulnerability that could be preyed upon. They all lacked a safety net, societal, familial, emotional, or some combination thereof, that might have broken their fall. Mostly, their stories weren't dramatic, they were typical American tales of neglect, of abuse doled out casually, of a steady stream of letdowns by people and institutions who should have propped them up. Badolato found that she had a knack for getting them to talk about this, for getting them to open up to her. She didn't look like an FBI agent, at least not what they'd imagined. She spoke softly, but with authority and a slight vocal fry. And she thinks that, at some level, they could probably sense that she'd once been a vulnerable kid too, that with only a few slightly different twists of fate, she could have become a trafficking victim herself, and that she knew it. My trauma looks different than theirs, but it's trauma nonetheless, she says. And I think victims can feel that. As the task force learned more about the psychology of victims, they also learned more about the ways in which their vulnerability was being manipulated, and how those ways were evolving. It was known in law enforcement circles that once a skilled trafficker set his or her sights on a vulnerable young person, they could be groomed in a matter of days, one day for an introduction, a day or two to make the victim feel special and cared for, and then the day when a friend comes over and he needs to be cared for as well. Sometimes violence was involved at that point, sometimes drug use was involved throughout. But emotional manipulation was the key element, which is why it was so easy for grooming to move online, for groomers to take advantage of the false senses of connection fostered on social media. Of the victims who are not being trafficked by family members, the majority are being groomed in this way. I would say that probably 75% of the initial grooming is happening online now, says Cindy Malott, the director of U.S. SAFE programs at Crisis Aid International. Recruiters used to have to work really, really hard to get access to kids, but now they're practically sitting in a child's bedroom. And kids put everything out there, what's going on in their life, who they're angry about, parents are going through a divorce, their insecurities about their body, about themselves, what they do, how they spend their time, so it's like a gift to these predators. The ways to manipulate are legion. Get a kid to send a compromising photo, and she'll do almost anything to keep you from sending it out to all her Facebook friends. Find out a gay kid is still closeted, and the threat of outing him gives you incredible power. And predators aren't just on Instagram and Snapchat, they lurk in the chat functions of Roblox, Minecraft, Grand Theft Auto. They're everywhere, says Malott. People think, oh, I just got to keep my kids away from those porn sites, those horrible places. Well, no, predators are gonna go where the kids are. And once there, they're going to zero in on the kids who are most vulnerable. That's what got to Badolato. In her online undercover work, she'd plumbed the psychology of pedophiles, but now she wasn't just dealing with suspects, she was spending time with victims and seeing the same vulnerabilities in them that the traffickers had seen, the instability or poverty, the addiction or mental health issues or abuse that had been normalized in their lives long before the traffickers entered them. Sometimes Badolato couldn't help but feel that all the conspiracies and misconceptions weren't just a distraction from the truth of trafficking, but rather some sick attempt to let society off the hook for trying to solve the much more intractable problems at trafficking's root. People would rather stick their head in the sand than address the real problem, because then you have to face and talk about the societal issues, she says. With a movie like Sound of Freedom, it's like, oh, this is in a jungle in South America. This isn't actually in my neighborhood. You know? It's easier for people to ignore the problem than deal with the issues on a societal level. By the time Badolato was sitting in that Chevy with Sierra, on that blighted Ohio block, she knew that the rate of re-victimization for children who are trafficked was as high as 95%, according to FBI reports. She knew that 90% of sex trafficking victims have a history of child sexual abuse, that more than 75% had lived in foster or adoptive care. She knew that she could arrest one perpetrator, and another would pop up in his place, that she could send one pimp to prison and the same victims would show up to sting some short time later, run by a different crew. She knew that testifying was a way for Sierra to psychologically push back against what had happened to her, and she was right. After the young woman took the stand on January 10, 2017, Parks was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years. While testifying, Sierra had seemed to transform, to channel, and embody a sort of empowerment. But Badolato also knew that once her testimony was over, Sierra would go back to that blighted block. She wondered how long that empowerment would last. She also wondered about her own trajectory, her own ability to continue doing this work. The youngest trafficking victim she'd ever recovered from a sting op, an 11-year-old who'd been recruited through Facebook, had been returned to her family in a house that had no heat. Badolato had used an FBI slush fund to get it turned back on. One did not become immune to the human misery of such things. They compounded, became harder and harder to compartmentalize. It's just a combination of all of those years and it's all awful, she says. But there are particular moments that, for one reason or another, you can't get out of your head. I just don't think it's in human nature to be exposed to that for so long and it not start changing who you are. One night, at a restaurant near where Badolato lives, I ask her whether she thinks children are being sex trafficked right then, in that very moment, in just the mile or two radius around us. She's quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed downward at her glass of wine. By the time she looks up, her whole body is trembling. It's happening right now, she says quietly. Right now some little girl is being dropped off in the parking lot of a motel. There are 3 or 4 girls holed up in a hotel next to a McDonald's. It's not only when we think about it. It is happening all the time. And if I'm just sitting here, present, having dinner, not thinking about it, that means I'm ignoring a problem that I know is real. Tears stream down her face. Many images have never left my mind, she says. It's really hard to have worked your entire life in law enforcement with a lot of child crime victims and be at the end of your career looking at the situation where you realize you can only do so much to make a difference. Badolato wipes back the tears with the palm of her hand and shudders her head, as if she can shake the thoughts away. Damn, she says. Fuck. I shouldn't be the one crying. I'm not the victim of this. The veteran agent steels herself and repeats, I am not the victim. The house where Corina Ellison says she was first sex trafficked no longer exists. It once stood on an unassuming lot in a residential suburb of Portland, Oregon, that stumbles down to the banks of the Willamette River. Now, Ellison can't quite bring the house's features to mind. She was so young back then, maybe 4 or 5. There is so much she's repressed, or only pieced together after the fact. As a child, she wouldn't have known what she now believes to be true, that her grandmother scored her drugs by offering up her youngest daughter, Ellison's mom. Or that, once her mom was hooked on the meth cooked by the man who'd lived in that house, she'd known just what to do to get more. But Ellison does remember being inside the house, unclothed. She does remember how the man would touch her. Her life unspooled from there. Her father died of a heroin overdose when she was 6. Her mom lost custody for good. She bounced around foster care, then various residential institutions, then whatever shelter she could find. In the story she tells of how she was sex trafficked again in her teenage years, there's no moment of drama, no kidnapping, no clear coercion. There was just a random, rainy afternoon when she had no place to go and was alone in the street and a car pulled up. The man inside took her home with him, fed her, introduced her to his girlfriend. They took her shopping. They let her stay. When men showed up at the home to have sex with the woman, Ellison was invited to watch, but she wasn't expected to participate, not at first, anyway. According to a statement Ellison later made to law enforcement, she just realized that people aren't going to take care of me for free. Soon, the woman was posting Ellison's services on Backpage, $150 for half an hour, $200 for a full one, and the trio were traveling the Midwest. For a long time, it didn't even occur to Ellison, then 16, to leave. Where would I have gone, she asks. I'd been missing for over a year. Nobody was looking for me. When the man told her to call him daddy, she complied. That was more than a decade ago, near the beginning of Badolato's tenure as head of the Child Exploitation Task Force. But by 2021, leaving it had seemed a necessary form of self-preservation. One of her last cases had gone well legally. The perp, a retired police officer from California who had produced child sex abuse materials of 3 sisters in Manila, had pleaded guilty to such charges when he learned that Badolato had brought the girls to the States to testify against him. But the experience had been emotionally devastating for Badolato, who had wanted the sisters, then 16, 13, and 11, to have memories of the U.S. that consisted of more than reliving their trauma in a courtroom. She took them shopping and to the zoo, invited them to her home to have dinner with her own family, saw them slowly start to open up and laugh and behave like the children they were. Then she'd had to put them on a flight back to Manila, back to the aunt who had allowed the man to abuse them and who Badolato had been unable to extradite. Fortunately, she says, their estranged father ended up intervening and taking custody of the girls, but that feeling of futility in the fight lingered. If I can be perfectly honest, Badolato says, I truly don't believe that the FBI realizes what they put their agents through doing that kind of work. I stayed for a little bit longer after that trial, but it really was when I should have been able to look myself in the mirror and say, Nikki, you're done, Badolato had told me in St. Louis. It became clear that I had been doing it too long. She'd spend the last couple of years working national security, a position without the immediacy of child exploitation work, but also without the heartache. If I can be perfectly honest, I truly don't believe that the FBI realizes what they put their agents through doing that kind of work. I just don't, she says. And yet, here Badolato was in Portland, leading Ellison, now 30, up to her hotel room, telling her about all the announcements she'd heard in the Atlanta airport instructing travelers to be on the lookout for sex trafficking. It's like white noise in the background, she says as Ellison settles into the sofa. It's a false sense of doing something to help. Here's the thing, nobody knows what to look for, Ellison agrees. And what about the victims who are in that airport, who are walking around and listening? Badolato asks. I wouldn't have even heard that announcement, Ellison replies. Because I didn't feel like a victim. It goes a lot deeper than anybody realizes. That's what she and Badolato both understand. That's why they started talking 8 months ago. Of all the teenage victims Badolato's task force recovered, Ellison is one of the few who she knows has permanently extricated herself from being prostituted, though it took years for her to get to that point, years for her to see that what happened to her was not her fault but rather a fault in the system, a fault in many systems over the course of generations. Neither she nor Badolato can fix that. Yet they can't help feeling like there's something they can fix or at least try to. Under the umbrella of an organization she's founded called Innocent Warriors, Badolato created a program for schools, instructing educators on the signs that might indicate a student is being trafficked and teaching kids how to avoid getting groomed online, which, she believes, is not about stranger danger but rather an awareness of subtle manipulation. Ellison has been working with trafficked youth through nonprofits like Children of the Night, the residential program where Badolato's team sent her when she was 17. Together, they've been talking about having Ellison help train undercovers who are learning to do trafficking sting ops. They've also discussed starting a mentorship program in which children who are still being sex trafficked are paired with young adults like Ellison who once were, providing a way for victims to begin to envision a different future for themselves and a path toward it even while being prostituted. Such a program may be retroactive rather than proactive, but it would capitalize on Badolato's and Ellison's experience and expertise, and it could help in the healing of mentors and ments alike. Badolato had traveled to Portland for the two to talk face-to-face about how the program might work. You have to understand how they've been traumatized because sometimes, to a child, relating doesn't sound like you're relating. It sounds like you're pointing out all the bad things in them, says Ellison from the driver's seat of her Nissan Pathfinder as she drives Badolato around to show her certain landmarks of her past after she'd left Children of the Night, the bridge she'd slept under for over a year after a boyfriend had gotten her hooked on heroin, the blocks downtown where she'd bounced between a children's shelter and the needle exchange. It had taken a prison sentence for her to finally break her addiction and commit to a different kind of life, though that evolution had had less to do with not having access to drugs than with seeing her own mother cycle in and out of the same facility, like looking into her own future and witnessing how bleak it would be. Maybe, she thought, she could provide the inverse of that for kids in Innocent Warriors. Maybe she could reverse engineer her own escape. I just want to make it very clear that if you were a victim, you are a victim, and just to not have any shame in that, she tells Badolato as they drive through Portland's misty streets. What I anticipate and hope is that then we get survivors that are like, they get it, Badolato replies. And that it opens up doors to help, for people to recognize that there are people who get what's really going on. It took a really long time for me, Ellison says, of coming to terms with her own victimhood. It's like reworking your thought process about some of those things, Badolato agrees. And that's hard, and it happens slowly over time, and it looks different for everybody. Ellison grips the wheel tightly. The truth does matter. It does. The truth is the fucking truth. And it's been empowering to be able to talk about it, because that's another way that I've realized, like, man, I was a victim, is re-going over all of this. Because when it happens so many times, you do blame yourself. It's a lot easier to just continue to live in a lie than believe that you were lied to. Still, Ellison and Badolato agree that the impressionability that makes children vulnerable is also what makes them open to guidance and mentorship if a relationship of trust can be established. What do you think a parent does? They groom you. I'd been waiting to be guided and groomed, Ellison says. It's been instructive to see that potential from another perspective, as a mother doing the guiding. As the afternoon wears on, Ellison stops to pick up her then 15-month-old son, who was being watched by a social worker friend. She buckles the little boy into his car seat, ruffles his hair, and passes him a bottle. He grins widely and begins removing his shoes and socks, throwing them gleefully onto the floor of the car and then kicking his tiny feet in time with the music as Ellison glances back at him and smiles. Kids are so perfect, she says. The last stop of the day is the large plot of land where the drug dealer's house once stood. Now, it's been turned into a playground, with brightly colored jungle gyms, a covered picnic area, and a large lawn, where a couple leisurely walks their dog. Ellison and Badolato climb down from the car and stand at the park's edge, as Ellison's son toddles around the grass, oblivious to what had transpired in that very spot. There is some form of poetic justice in the land being earmarked for children's enjoyment, but neither woman voices it. Mostly, they're quiet. Night is falling, the air growing cooler, and the gray sky fading into dusk. You would never think a park could hide what it used to be, Ellison says at last. And yet it did. Driving off with Badolato at her side and her son babbling happily in the back seat, Ellison glances in the rearview mirror, but only for a moment. Badolato keeps her eyes fixed only on the road ahead. Story 4. The kidnapping I can't escape. 50 years ago, my father's friend was taken at gunpoint on Long Island. Then he went on with his life, and that's the part that haunts me. On November 12, 1974, my father's childhood friend Jack Tyke was kidnapped out of his driveway in the nicest part of Long Island. He was arriving home from work at Acme Steel Partition and Door, the steel fabrication company that his family owned in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. It was 6:40 p.m., and it was raining. He pulled up to the house and killed the engine of his Lincoln coupe, but saw that the white exterior of the garage door still glowed even though he had turned his high beams off. He twisted around in the driver's seat and saw another car in the driveway, its headlights blinding him. "Excuse me," a man called. He was now outside the car, but Jack could see him only in silhouette because of how bright the headlights were. "You know how to get to Northern Boulevard?" Jack stepped out of his car. He was surprised. His street was so far off the commuter path that it would be hard to get lost and end up there looking for Northern Boulevard. In fact, when Jack saw headlights in his rearview mirror as he approached the house that night, he thought how strange and rare it was to be on that same road with anyone. "Excuse me?" Jack asked. But now the man was approaching. As he grew closer, Jack saw that he was wearing a ski mask and holding a long-barrel silver pistol. That's when he also saw a second man, taller, this one holding a shotgun and also wearing a ski mask. "You're coming with us," the first man said. "Get over here or we're going to blow your head off." Jack froze for a moment. He considered running behind the house, into the thicket of trees there, but he thought about his wife, Janet, and his two small sons, 6-year-old Mark and 2-year-old Michael, who were in the house right then, how running might put them in danger. But there was no time to think it through. The first man had already grabbed Jack and was hustling him into the car. One of the men pushed Jack into the back seat and forced him to lie down. They put handcuffs on his wrists and removed his glasses, mashing some kind of putty over his eyes, followed by a different pair of glasses. There was a can of gasoline on the floor of the back seat, the last thing he saw before they blocked out his vision, and when Jack was forced to lie down, its stench filled his nostrils. Someone put a large sheet of cardboard over his body and shut the door. They asked him his name. He told them it was Jack. Jack Tyke, right, one of them asked, the only one who would speak to him from then on. Then he said, "You're a Jew, right?" Jack replied that he was, and grew even more scared because it was not good news then, or, really, any time in history, to be asked that question. Eventually the car stopped, and the men pulled him out and directed him down a path, then up a bunch of steps. He remembers a lock, then another lock, then the sound his dress shoes made on the floor. They searched his pockets and put him into what he thinks must have been a closet. His head hit what felt like a wire hanger. The men wrapped chains around his legs and neck and padlocked them to some sort of hook on the closet wall. One of them dug the putty out of Jack's eyes and then wrapped an adhesive bandage around his head. The main kidnapper began interrogating him. He wanted the names, birthdays, addresses, and phone numbers of his family members. He wanted to know how much money was in the family business. He asked how payroll worked. He asked about profits and unions and the company's real estate holdings. He asked Jack what he owned, art, cars, buildings. He asked where he vacationed, if he had maids or a butler. He asked what kind of stocks he had, if he had a mortgage. He asked how much Jack donated to the Jewish Defense League. The answer, nothing. He berated Jack for hours about the plight of the Palestinians, ranting that the Jews were going to kill Yasser Arafat, the PLO leader. He ranted further about Jewish slumlords but veered into non sequiturs. Your money is going overseas to buy food for poor people. He told Jack he had a PhD. He told him he had 9 children. The man was organized and depraved. He was smart and completely nuts. The kidnapper forced him to record an audio message, which began like this: "I'm in a place where there's no escape from. The group is serious, and they mean what they say. Janet, don't call the police." On the second night Jack was gone, Janet received a call from someone demanding a ransom of $750,000 and promising to call again with details. The next night, the caller told Janet to tell Jack's brother Buddy to go to the Exxon station near his house in Westchester and check the trash can there. There, in a vinyl bag, Buddy found a few of Jack's personal items, a tape of the recording he made and a letter of instruction that told them how to divide the money, old bills, not in sequence, unmarked and unrecorded. On Tuesday, November 19, a week after Jack first disappeared, Janet and Buddy drove to the city with agents in cars behind them and a surveillance helicopter above them. They arrived at a telephone bank in Times Square at 6:30 p.m., as instructed. From there, a series of phone calls sent them scrambling to several different phone booths and eventually down into Penn Station and then toward a locker Penn Station used to provide lockers to drop the money there. Here was the problem, other than the main problem, which was that 2 terrified, exhausted civilians from the suburbs were doing a ransom drop for a violent lunatic criminal. There were dozens of FBI agents and police officers and detectives swirling around the drop. But underground at Penn Station, Janet and Buddy's 2-way radios stopped working, and chaos ensued. Buddy accidentally put the bag of money in the wrong locker. The man on the phone told Janet that Buddy couldn't be trusted. After another series of calls at different booths, Buddy and Janet corrected the mistake and finally got a call telling them they had done a good job and to go home. In the chaos, the bag man got away. Sometime later, Jack was yanked out of the closet. The main kidnapper told him that, though they had strongly considered killing him, they had decided it was better to send him home so that he could tell the world about the plight of poor people, as he'd been lectured about. He told Jack they would be watching him. They put wax in his ears and bandages over his eyes and black shoe polish on his face. Then they stuffed him back into a car and dumped him just off the Belt Parkway. Jack staggered to the Jade East Motel, right near John F. Kennedy Airport, and he called home. He was picked up a few minutes later and taken directly to the F.B.I.'s Manhattan headquarters on East 69th Street, where he remained through the night for debriefing. Janet eventually arrived, and by the time the Tykes left in the morning, the entirety of the New York press was outside, waiting for him. The pictures published in the Daily News and elsewhere the next day show him and Janet, shell-shocked but intact. A miracle. Jack was home safe. He had survived his kidnapping. But the actual kidnapping is not what this story is about, if you can believe it. It's about surviving what you survived, which is also known as the rest of your life. After Jack's return, the Tykes moved on. They stayed in their home in Kings Point, determined not to further destabilize the children. Jack went back to work. The kids went back to school. They didn't talk about the kidnapping. It wasn't a factor in their lives. How much did the kidnapping not hover over them? Well, eventually, several years after the incident, Jack and Janet welcomed a third child, Jamie, a daughter. Jamie did not know her father was kidnapped until she was 13. She found out one day when she was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a young adult novel called The Face on the Milk Carton. It was a book I remember everyone our age range reading at the time, about a teenage girl who sees her own face on a milk carton, marked as a missing person, and begins to realize that she is not being raised by her biological parents. Jamie remarked to her mother how scary the premise was to her, and Janet looked up and said, "I have to tell you something." That's how little the kidnapping loomed. Then, a few years ago, Jack was at a dinner with some people from a professional association he belongs to when this question went around: if you were to write a book about your life, what would you call it? Jack knew the answer immediately. "I'd call it Operation Jacknap," he said. Jacknap was the name that the FBI had given Jack's case. The table greeted this with silence. Jack was almost 80 by then. He had rarely talked in public or even in private about his experience. Most of the people there had no idea he had even been kidnapped. Maybe some of them remembered the news story, but how do you bring that up? Also, how do you square a kidnapping with the prosperous, flourishing factory owner and proud family man that he so clearly was? You see, Jack was fine. He was better than fine. He was successful, an emblem of a dream that his ancestors just 2 generations back couldn't have even known how to dream about. His business was thriving. He was healthy. His family traveled. They collected art. They educated their children. Look at what a person can endure and end up totally great. The Tykes walked in lockstep toward a bright future that was, and is, the Jewish dream of America. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that you could go through that and end up fine? I've known the Tykes my whole life. My father grew up with Janet and her brother, Richard, in Great Neck, the area that Kings Point is part of. Jack was a few years older, but he, too, grew up in Great Neck, right across the street from Janet. As an adult, my father was at the forefront of the baffling new world of business computing in the 1980s, and Jack hired him as a consultant for Acme, where he automated and streamlined the company's manufacturing systems. I would go to Greenpoint to work with him sometimes, and Jack was always nice to me, giving me small tasks like shredding old documents that probably didn't need to be shredded. He wore suits and took charge and commanded respect and came to define businessman in my mind. Also, he looked to me like Neil Diamond. We had a Neil Diamond album at home, and I spent some time when I was 5 or 6 thinking that it was Jack on the cover of that album, that he had this whole other life. I grew up, my father left Acme, and I rarely saw the Tykes. Mark, the eldest son, and I found each other again as adults. He's a few years older than I am, and when I graduated from college and got my first job, he was already living in the city, married with a child. In 2001, I was let go from my job at a soap opera magazine, yes, and the next day, he called up to my apartment and told me to come downstairs. He drove me to Stu Leonard's in his convertible and bought me a refrigerator full of groceries and gave me a summer job doing data entry at Acme for $500 a week, which allowed me to start writing freelance articles, which allowed me to eventually end up here, doing this. Mark and I stayed in warm touch. Then, several years ago, I texted him to ask if we could get together. Mark responded immediately and said that, actually, he had been about to reach out to me and he and his father would love to meet up. We met near Bryant Park for lunch. I told them I was about to start writing my second novel. It was about a wealthy family on Long Island who lose their money, the leakage of my frustrations at watching the middle class disappear and at the moneylessness of my own youth. Let's all agree, for the sake of this story, that relative moneylessness isn't a dollar amount but a state of mind and stomach born of your own particular circumstance. I was grappling with a question I had, which was this: who was better off, people who were born with money and never had to worry about their survival, or people, like me, who didn't feel they had the financial stability and who had to learn to be survivors on their own? Did having money doom you in a way? I wanted to see the Tikes because I was embarrassed to report that, though the fictional family in my unfinished novel bore only rudimentary biographical resemblance to them, a kidnapping kept finding its way into the plot. There was something I couldn't resist thematically about it, because it elucidated one of the many paradoxes of money, that money can put you in a kind of danger even as it brings you safety, too. Jack gave me his blessing immediately. In fact, he said, it was funny that I was writing something like that, because he had been thinking about writing a book himself. A few years earlier, he saw a write-up about the memoir of a guy he knew, a man who survived Auschwitz and went on to become a successful tailor. Jack realized he wanted to tell his story, too. He had suddenly found himself closer to the end of his life than the middle of it, and he decided that he wanted to write a book that he wouldn't leave this world without a document that would exist to let his children and grandchildren know what had happened to him. That's why he wanted to talk to me, to get my advice on publishing. I offered to give him whatever help I could. I introduced him to an entertainment lawyer, to help him negotiate with a ghostwriter, and every now and then I would get an update, that he really enjoyed working with the ghostwriter, that they hired someone to make a Wikipedia page about the kidnapping, that, finally, a small publisher was interested. In March 2020, I received the finished book in the mail, Operation Jackknap, a true story of kidnapping, extortion, ransom and rescue, by Jack Tyke, his name done up like cutout letters from a ransom note. I didn't read Jack's book for a while. I didn't want to confuse myself between the kidnapping I was writing and the one that actually happened, but on the day I sent in my final pass on Long Island Compromise, which is what I called my novel, I finally opened it. I read it in one sitting. I hadn't known much about the kidnapping in the first place, just that Jack had been taken from his own driveway and released a week later. Now I learned the details, not just of the abduction and confinement but of the harrowing rescue and its aftermath. About the 2 times that the kidnappers tried to ensnare his brother Buddy, instead of him. About the man who was eventually caught with $38,300 of the ransom money and his association with another person of interest, a former Acme employee who had distributed anti-Semitic literature at work and who went on the run for 4 years after he was questioned by Nassau County detectives. An employee. Law enforcement suspected that 3 or 4 men had been involved, but only 2 were indicted. The Acme employee was one of them and only one went to prison. The bulk of the ransom was never found. The details of the kidnapping, way more involved than I was able to detail above, and subsequent investigation are riveting. You should read Jack's book. But as I was reading it, it wasn't those details that gripped me. No, it was how he told the story. In Operation Jackknap, he tells the story of his rescue as if it were a miracle. Each small vignette he tells is set up in a way that shows how a good resolution to the story seemed completely out of the question until others devoted themselves to his rescue. He writes about the irrepressible Dick McGuire, the detective sergeant with Nassau County who wouldn't stop digging even after all the trails went cold. He writes about kind Joe Polymine, the Nassau County police officer who lived with and guarded Jack's family for an 8-hour shift every day for almost a year after the kidnapping. He writes about Gene Batzer, the journalist from the Long Island Press who found out about the kidnapping but held the story when the police asked him to, for Jack's safety. Can you imagine that? A newspaper reporter would hold a story just for him. He's sure he would be dead if the story had run. He writes about John Malone, who, even though he was an assistant director in charge of the F.B.I.'s New York field office, took Jack out night after night, checking to see if he could hear a match for any of the trains or church bells he remembered from his time in captivity. About how the tough, devoted FBI agent Margot Dendy, who lived with Janet during that terrible week, became a kind of sister to her for the rest of her life. About how Janet and Buddy were so courageous to do the ransom drop that day themselves, and how Janet in particular rose to every challenge that was presented, that week and for the rest of her life. All these people, the book underscores, worked tirelessly around the clock to make sure that Jack was released. He can't believe how smart everyone was, how professional, how dedicated. He thinks about when he was picked up from the Jade East in Jamaica, near the airport. How, when he arrived at the FBI headquarters and was led in through a giant bullpen filled with hundreds of agents, the room went silent. Every single agent stood up as Jack walked through. It's that moment he thinks about when he thinks about his kidnapping. It's the friendships, it's the way everyone came through for him, not the rest of it. That detail about all the agents standing up isn't in the book. When Jack told it to me recently, I cried. But it's not Jack that I was crying for. Tolstoy tells us that all happy families are alike and that each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. A few years ago, I wrote a different novel, my first novel, about divorce, which was inspired in part by the divorce stories of several people I know, and I came to the conclusion that, actually, all divorces are exactly alike. I tell you this because I've now come to understand the same thing about trauma. Happy, well-adjusted people are all different. The traumatized are exactly alike. I'm about to tell you a story that is nothing like a violent kidnapping, almost laughably so, but what I've learned over the years is that trauma is trauma. Something terrible happens, beyond what is in our own personal capacity to cope with, and the details don't matter as much as the state we're thrown into. Our bodies and brains have not evolved to reliably differentiate a rape at knife point from a job loss that threatens us with financial ruin, or from the dismantling of our world by our parents' divorce. It's wrong, but explain that to your poor, battered autonomic nervous system. 16 years ago, I was 39 weeks pregnant when my obstetrician sent me to the hospital to be induced. I didn't dilate easily, or at all, and the first night I was there I was advised not to get an epidural despite the pain of the contractions because it would slow dilation even further. That night, my husband went to sleep, and I was asked if I wanted pain medication so that I could sleep, too. I was offered Stadol. I told the nurse I had a history of anxiety. Would this be okay to take? She said yes, and within a minute of it entering my bloodstream, I began hallucinating. I was on a swing in my hallucination, the one in the backyard of my father's old house on Long Island. Every time I swung forward, I came so close to the house next door I almost crashed, and then I was yanked back. I was terrified, but I couldn't cry or call for help because I was sure my snoring husband, whom I love and don't fear when I'm not hallucinating, was a snarling monster whose wrath would be great if I disturbed him. Hours later, I whispered to the nurse that I had thought she was giving me something like Tylenol, not a narcotic. I told her I was hallucinating. She nodded and told me that sometimes that happens. The next day, a different nurse told me that I still hadn't dilated, and my body showed no signs of being ready to give birth. I'd been in induced labor for 24 hours by then. I was exhausted. She told me my blood pressure was down, and not to tell the doctor that she was saying this, but that I should ask to give up on the induction. She told me to tell him I would stay on bed rest in the hospital even, but that this baby didn't seem to want to come out yet. When the doctor finally came, I told him just what the nurse said to say. He told me that he would examine me and that if I still wasn't dilated, we would talk about going home. But while he was examining me, I felt a searing kind of pain. I screamed. It went on. I screamed to my husband, he's not examining me. He's doing something to me. I screamed at the doctor to stop it, but he wouldn't. I screamed over and over for him to stop, and he still wouldn't. My husband stood frozen. The nurse avoided looking at me. Finally, I heard the doctor tell her, that same nurse, who now pretended we'd never seen each other, to get the hook. I screamed at him that I knew what the hook was for and that he didn't have my permission to break my water. He told me that I wasn't going home, that he'd stripped my membrane, that there was nothing left to do but break my water and hope I dilated. Defeated, I lay back and let him do it. As anyone could have predicted, 11 hours later, I was headed to the operating room for an emergency C-section. I lay splayed out on that table, paralyzed from the chest down. Eventually I heard my baby cry. I refused pain medication after my C-section, afraid that whatever they gave me would make me hallucinate again. I cried day and night, asking the doctors and nurses if my behavior seemed normal, and they ignored me. What was all that talk about making sure to tell someone if you're worried that you're going to hurt yourself or your baby? I couldn't look down at my torn-up body. I refused to go to sleep, worried that I would do something to the baby while I was unconscious. I couldn't stop telling any visitor what had happened to me. At the end of my hospital stay, a nurse wheeled me out of the hospital, and while we were waiting for my husband to pull the car around, she said, "You just need some Jesus." At home, I was afraid to be alone with the baby. I still couldn't stop telling everyone the story, just about everyone I encountered. To this day, I remember every single person who wouldn't let me finish telling it, who stopped me and wouldn't let me go on for whatever reason, and I hate them for it. I sought treatment, all kinds. I had my first visit with a psychiatrist within a week, and she told me I had postpartum depression. I went to postpartum depression support groups, where I cried so loudly that other people had to stop talking and wait for me to quiet down. I returned to the psychiatrists to tell them that I didn't feel depressed or otherwise identify with those faded women in those groups. I felt insane. I was scared all the time. I couldn't stop reliving what had happened to me. I couldn't lie on my back because it reminded me of the C-section. I asked everyone who would listen what I should do for this unbearable psychic pain. I sat up every night watching TV, wondering about the impact on a baby from a mother who cried all the time. I went to see doctors constantly. I thought I had a blood clot. I thought I had a brain tumor. I thought I was bleeding too much. I didn't understand why I stopped bleeding so abruptly. I sat in front of a seasonal affective disorder lamp. I did something called body work. I did postpartum therapy. I did talk therapy. I did a progenitor of what would become EMDR. I went to my rabbi. I went to someone else's priest. Lord help me, I consulted the internet. I couldn't smell rubbing alcohol because it reminded me of the birthing room. I bought a liquid soap that I kept in my bag. It was Method brand, the sweet water scent, and smelled that if I got a whiff of hand sanitizer or rubbing alcohol, which was often, because I was constantly going to hospitals and doctors' offices to check out my imagined ailments. At the hospital, I passed a sign for a rape support group. I didn't dare go in, but I stared at it for a long time, suspecting that the people in there would understand me better than anyone outside did. I prayed. How I prayed. I screamed at the sky. I begged God to help me, to save me from whatever it was that had taken me away from my life, that made it so that I now could see the world in the uncanny, photo-negative way that it wasn't meant to be seen, but that was the truth I can't shake even to this day. And then a few months passed, and my husband found a different psychiatrist for me to talk to, someone who did not specialize in postpartum issues. He diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress syndrome and gave me some Zoloft, then some Buletin-Spar to help it along. I began to get better. I could sleep again. I wasn't quite as scared anymore. I would like to say that I became myself again. But I never did. I never got over it. I never stopped being bitter about that time, about how lonely and scared I was. I never stopped worrying about the impact it had on my wonderful child. I never got over the fear on my husband's face as I screamed for help. I truly never got over how apparently fragile I am, how unresilient I proved to be. That was one of the worst parts for me, that I knew something about myself now, which was that I was delicate. I had been rocked into a full nervous breakdown, and I had no idea what aspect of the birth did it. All I knew was that, should something go wrong, a car accident, maybe, or a mugging, I would be prone to falling apart. It was that fragility that I just couldn't get over. I had thought I was such a tough guy, but that doctor took one look at me, and he knew that I would literally lie back and accept his treatment of me. You'll say I'm being unnecessarily hard on myself, but months later, I saw the doctor, and instead of confronting him, or spitting in his face, I hid behind a tree. A few years later, I was contacted by someone who had used that same obstetrician and had heard that I had, too. She called me up and told me that she had filed a complaint about him with the local police, and it would really help if I told them my story too. I told her I absolutely would, and then I never did and never took a call from that number again. The pandemic came, and the smell of all that hand sanitizer nearly drove me off a cliff. Worse, my husband brought home a pallet of Method Sweet Water scented soap, remembering how much I liked the smell of it. Only now it reminded me of the darkest time in my life. And I never stopped needing to tell the story. A couple of years after it happened, I began writing about it, first for an online magazine, then a women's print one. Eventually it somehow helped me parlay this into a real career, and it would have been totally reasonable for me to move on and never write about it again. Except that I still was. In my first novel, I found myself giving the story of my son's birth to the book's most neglected and misunderstood character. There was never a time I reread that passage, not in edits, not in copy edits, not in the first or second pass, that I didn't sob. I helped make the TV show version of my book, and I watched the birth scenes play out, angle after angle. I sobbed at my monitor at every single take while everyone around me pretended that my behavior was totally normal. In the editing room, I sobbed every one of the 50 times I watched each of those takes, the editor and producers kindly waiting a moment until I could speak again. At one point, it occurred to me that, all these years later, I had not gotten over anything so much as I had built a city out of my suffering, a monument to my trauma. I had done hours of exposure therapy by then, and my last word on exposure therapy is that if it worked, then hiring a world-class actress to play out the worst day of my life over and over would have made it so that I am not sobbing even right now as I type this. So what does this have to do with Jack Tyke? I'll tell you, as I sat and read his book, I couldn't completely dismiss the idea that if I had just figured out a way to find some gratitude that I had survived that day, I could have borne the whole thing more gracefully. I left that hospital, my need for Jesus notwithstanding, physically healthy and alive. My baby was healthy and even the kind of even-tempered, good napping child that would take a mother's nervous breakdown in stride. What I'm saying is that I read Jack's book and wondered why I couldn't be like that. I didn't know why I couldn't get over it. I don't know why I can't get over it now. Yes, if only I could be more like Jack, I thought, at every stop on this story. But that's because I didn't see what was going on yet. A few weeks ago, I went to visit Jack at his home in Westchester, where he and his family relocated in 1986. After years of discussion over whether they should move, what eventually got the Tykes out of Kings Point was a summer house they purchased in the Berkshires and how much longer it took to get there from Long Island. Jack unlocked the door and let me in, then locked the door behind me, ushering me into his office. He was on hold with American Express, he explained, coordinating a driver to pick him up from the airport on a trip he was planning to Greece. At that point, I thought I was going to focus this article on the ransom money, which was never found. $750,000 would be more than $4.5 million in today's dollars, and its mystery vexes Jack to this day. He keeps a website with information about the case and lists a post office box for tips and clues, so that anyone reading his book, or now this article, who knows something might come forward. He even offers a reward. I asked him why he wanted the money back. It wasn't all that much, compared with his fortune today. But he wouldn't take a penny of it, he told me. He would donate it to the Federal Law Enforcement Foundation, which provides federal and local law enforcement with financial assistance. Justice, he told me that was why he was interested in recovering the money. Someone at American Express was talking to him now, and so I stood up and began to wander around his office while he made his arrangements. In one corner is a set of glass shelves with family photos, Jamie with her husband and children, Mark's high school graduation portrait, Michael and his wife, Janet and Jack with a group of friends. On the top shelf is a photo that is as large as any of them. It's a portrait of Jack pointing, and it's a familiar one to me. In 1994, the one convicted kidnapper, a man named Richard Warren Williams, who had been in prison for 17 years, appealed the verdict by citing a 1986 Supreme Court ruling that held jurors could not be dismissed on the basis of race. The jury for Williams's case had been all white. Of the 40 total potential jurors that had been dismissed, 6 were black. Records for the case were destroyed in a fire, and the prosecution was not able to remember the reasons for 3 of the 6 dismissals and was therefore unable to prove they were not racially motivated. Williams won his appeal, and a new trial was ordered. This time, Williams pleaded guilty. At the sentencing hearing, Jack spoke in court about what Williams did to him. That's where the picture is from, he is pointing at his kidnapper. The judge sentenced Williams to time served, and he was freed. After that, Jack got himself a permit for a pistol. These are vindictive people, he remembers saying at his permit hearing. They're crazy. Not stupid, but crazy. Jack got off the phone, apologizing, telling me he just needed to make sure that someone would be there to pick him up when he landed in Greece. I asked a version of a question I often have about my own trauma, which is that the trauma ended up giving so much to me: my journalism career, for one thing, plus my first novel and the TV show, for another, but, even better, a deeper understanding of how the traumatized world lives that I sometimes wonder if I could go back in time and make it never happen, if I even would. But he misinterpreted my question. He looked off and nodded and then returned to me with this: the recurring theme is, should I have taken off? Now, you have to understand, it was raining. It was dark. He went on, behind my house was a big woods, a woodsy area, and I was this close to taking off, and that is a recurring theme. I was surprised to hear that he still thought about what he could have done differently, that he had regrets and dwelled on them. It didn't match with the idea I had about Jack, the mythology of him as having put it all behind him. I asked him if he visits that moment in his mind very often. He leaned back and looked far away for a minute. I'll tell you what I do, he said. Once in a while, I pick up the book, and I keep it right by my bed. Once in a while, I'll actually read a chapter of the book. He nodded and closed his eyes, but he kept a faint smile on his face. Then I'll get upset, and I'll put it down. He opened his eyes and laughed at himself a little. I had noticed that, just a few feet away from the shelves of family pictures, there were 4 black file cabinets. 2 of the cabinets bore labels like auto, bank, mortgage, insurance, etc., but the other 2 cabinets weren't marked at all, and I asked what was in them. He opened them and showed me. Inside were the meticulously kept files of what happened to him. Folders labeled, Acme $750,000 ransom meeting, Jack Tyke 1997 court speech, various 1974 pictures, Special Agent Fred Barron's memo, letters to Joe Tyke after kidnapping. There's even a folder that says Taffy Ochner, containing our printed out email correspondence about the lawyer I introduced him to. He has piles of news clippings and court transcripts. He has photos and printed out ransom call transcripts, as well as cassettes and CDs of the ransom calls. I asked if he had a mechanism with which to play them, and he said that he also had the audio on his phone. Did I want to hear them? Of course I did. So we listened together. In the calls, Janet sounds alert and determined, Buddy is high-pitched and terrified. They are as painful as any recording I've ever heard, these moments of true panic and purpose, in which people who had already imagined the worst were now responsible for trying to produce the best possible ending to a terrible story. I watched Jack's face as he listened. He was nodding, watching me, both of us living inside this terrifying moment. I'm not sure what to call the look I saw on his face right then. Engagement would imply he isn't engaged at other times. Alive. He is nothing if not alive. I'm going to use the word relaxed, no matter how strange that might sound. But yes, he was more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. It was right then just as Buddy shrieked from Jack's cell phone, and Jack looked at me nodding with that small smile, and I looked down to find I was holding 2 reams of reproduced transcript printouts that I understood all of it at once. The ransom calls on his phone, available to listen to at any minute. The large photo of him pointing out his kidnapper, taking pride of place among his treasured family pictures. The pristinely kept, unmarked filing cabinets filled with all the details. The endless search for the money and the reward, which he says is because there are still people out there who caused him harm and they've never been apprehended, even though every suspect in the case is now dead. After his call, he washed 2 apples for me. He was worried we had spent so much time talking that I must be hungry. I took the apples but couldn't eat them. He keeps his ransom calls on his phone. He has a panic button at every outside door. There are lights everywhere. The place is never dark. The house alarm is never off. The doors are never not locked. I never shut it off, he said. Once you start shutting it off, you forget it. Later, at home, I scoured my transcript for what I'd missed. No. I sleep with the shades wide open. I like to wake up to the light, not to a dark room. No, I have a 4-door car, mid-size, with a nondescript license plate. I don't have my initials or anything. Because you're a target to get followed. I try not to leave in the dark. When I come home, when I make a turn, I look through the rearview mirror to see. I mean, it's instinct now. About the immediate aftermath of his homecoming, I didn't focus for a year. I mean minimum. You know, could have even been longer, but from what I remember, I didn't go to work for 2-3 weeks. Then when I started to go back to work, I just went and just sat there. I mean, I made believe I was working. I got up, shaved, showered, drove to the office, or I was driven, depending, and I just sat there all day and then came home at the end of the day. I didn't accomplish anything. I went back and reread the book, and this time I didn't cry. This time I kicked myself. Amid, yes, all the grateful notes and the storytelling that frames every move as miraculous, here it was, staring me in the face the whole time. Around Thanksgiving, when our children and grandkids gather at our home, a pang of panic for their safety jangles my subconscious, sending my heart hammering, he writes in one passage. In another, I hear a metal chain clink or rattle, and my mind zooms me back to the closet. He was not untraumatized by what happened. Nor was he pretending he wasn't or trying to hide anything from me. He hasn't moved on any more than I have. It was only willful blindness on my part that insisted on the juvenile fantasy that Jack was fine. I couldn't believe I missed it. Of course he wasn't fine. How could you be fine after something like that? I met with Mark a few days later and told him all this. I told him I had totally missed what happened to his father and probably what it meant for Mark's life, too. I told him I felt like an idiot and that I was sorry for the ways I was blind to what he went through. Mark laughed a little. Had I not been paying attention all these years? Did I not remember that his father had a heart attack shortly after the trial ended, at 38 years old? Did I not notice that his father's house in Westchester is 4 houses down from the local police department? I hadn't. I looked at a map. Jack lives 1,183 feet from the police station. He went on. Did I realize that in one of the other cottages on the property was an ostensible handyman who also served as a driver and bodyguard? Did he never tell me that his parents slept in a queen-size bed his whole life, him holding tight to her, arms and legs intertwined, as if they knew the perils of laying down their vigilance into unconsciousness, as if they knew that you could just disappear at any single moment? His own daughter didn't know he'd been kidnapped. Of course, though. Of course. How did I miss that? How had I been so determined to think of Jack as healed, as unscathed, maybe so that I could aspire to it myself, to hold it in the future as something that might happen. Now I thought about my new book, which revolves around the Fletcher family, the one whose father, Carl, is kidnapped. Yes, they're rich, they lose some of their money, they try to get it back. But mostly they are stunted by the kidnapping and Carl's refusal to engage with it. The oldest son is obsessed with safety, amassing insurances and crash test ratings. The middle son goes to hotel rooms to act out kidnappings with sex workers who think he's into S&M but don't know that his fetishes are far more baroque than that. And the daughter, born a few months after the kidnapping, works so hard to run from the family trauma ethos that she comes to define it. By the time I was done with it, it was clear to at least the people who wrote the marketing copy for it, but somehow not to me, that it was a book about a different kind of inheritance, the legacy of trauma. Maybe I was never writing a book about money. Maybe I had to think I was writing about money in order to find myself examining trauma again, because nothing had truly changed in all this time except the swell of my shame that I was still in this state, not trauma, but post-trauma, its own discrete nightmare where self-awareness doesn't ever seem to ameliorate its symptoms. Maybe I always was headed right here, to this moment, where I could finally revisit my own trauma, to make Snow Angels in it the only place where I'm truly comfortable. I wonder if you looked at my face on the set of the TV show I helped make, as I watched the worst day of my life play out, over and over, if, behind the tears, I looked the way Jack did when he was listening to his ransom calls. Upset, sure. But maybe a little relaxed, too. As if, for a moment, I could stop using all my energy to pretend that my own life wasn't kidnapped from me that day. And maybe if you could have seen my own expression while I was working on this article, not anguished, but relaxed, like Jack's when he was listening to those tapes, you would understand why it was worth the crime I myself was committing, which was forcing a man I care about, a man who has already been through quite enough, to revisit the worst week of his life in the twilight of his years so that I could better understand what happened to me. That's how the traumatized life goes, I guess. You work your whole life to overcome the terrible thing that happened to you, only to get to the end of it and find that the overcoming it was your life. You find the other people who share the unfixable tear in their perception of themselves and their circumstances, of how safe they are in the world, of the precariousness of knowing that it could happen again at any time, and you feel a little better. And then, at the end, the vine you rest beneath is that you get to stop working so hard to pretend you might put it behind you. I'm glad I learned that now. Because I'm telling you, the sheer amount of energy it takes to pretend that I'm over anything is killing me. The night I left Jack with the apples, and he unlocked the door to let me out and then locked it again after I left, he texted me. "Wow, that meeting today stirred up a lot of memories," he wrote. "I hope I can sleep." A couple of years after the trial ended, Jack began gathering the crew of people who had been involved in the kidnapping investigation once a year at Peter Luger in Brooklyn, near Acme. Over time, they started to get together more often. Margot Dendy, the FBI agent who lived with the family during Jack's abduction, became Janet's best friend. She told me that Janet was her North Star. Jack and Joe Polymine, the retired police officer who lived with them after the kidnapping, would sometimes go out fishing with their children. Dendy started coming to Passover Seders. In 2019, Buddy died at 91. Jack lost Janet to cancer in 2022 at the age of 78. The whole group was at her funeral. My father and I were, too, and a few months later, Dendy hosted a Catholic Mass in honor of Janet. Recently, the gang got together for lunch at the Peter Luger in Great Neck, on Northern Boulevard, 3.4 miles from the house where Jack Tyke was taken on a November evening, and his life as he knew it was never returned. It was a rainy day, and we were joined by Polly Mine, the Nassau County investigator, Dick McGuire, and the prosecutor Ed McCarty, who is now a retired judge. McGuire told me how he had come to suspect that a corrupt police officer might have orchestrated the whole thing. McCarty talked about how the children of the kidnappers must still have the money. I asked what was different about this case, why they all still got together, and McCarty answered by saying, the courage of the victim. Just to go through what he went through and how he held together and started his life right after the kidnapping. I mean, they helped us right away. Usually the victim is so traumatized they can't even talk. I asked if they got together with other victims they helped over the years. They told me no, that Jack was special, and unspoken in that was the fact that not all the victims make it home. Jack's case, while somewhat unsolved, had a happy ending. Look around, here it was. I turned off my tape recorder, and we finished lunch. Jack ordered dessert, and soon they were all making jokes about high cholesterol and tartar sauce. Polly Mine asked McCarty what he thought about the Trump trial. McGuire poked some fun at Jack for looking like Neil Diamond. Jack reported that recently, while he was visiting France, someone told him he looked like John Cain. Nobody knew who John Cain was, and eventually we realized, through a variety of clues, from The Godfather, that he meant James Caan. Everyone laughed. I thought about the question I asked Jack earlier, about whether he would change what happened to him if he could. He hadn't misinterpreted it. He had known something I didn't, which is that it's a bad question, that the thing not happening to you is never one of the options. It happened. It will never not have happened. Maybe, actually, there was something I could learn from Jack. That after all your attempts at healing, when you finally realize that you are forever changed, you can allow yourself to embrace your trauma. You survive what happened to you, then you survive your survival, and then the gift you're given is that you fall in love with your whole life, inextricable from the bad thing that happened to you. This is my world, Jack said. There was no mistaking his expression this time. He was happy. Before I end this, I want to say one more thing. The second time I gave birth, I was at a different hospital, at Cedars-Sinai, and I had a mercifully good experience. As I was writing this article, I used the bathroom at a restaurant, and the soap in the restroom there was the same brand that Cedars-Sinai used. I don't know its name, but I can identify it by scent. I've encountered it a few times since I had my second son. When I smell the soap, my system floods with the neural surprise that I felt on that day. Whatever it is, that's the opposite of trauma, that not everything is a fait accompli, that there are new experiences out there for me to have, that one day I could smell this smell enough times so that it would replace that other smell, and the terrible things that happened to me that terrible day would recede, eclipsed by the wonderful and regular things that have happened to me since then, that day would restore itself to its size, just another 24 hours, like all the other days, some of them good and some of them bad. I wanted to tell you that I still have some hope that it could happen. Story 5. The Lost Stradivarius. In the year 1885, Jean Bott, a native of Hesse-Kassel, Germany, emigrated with his wife Matilda to this country, bringing with him a celebrated violin known as the Duke of Cambridge Stradivarius, which he had purchased in 1873 for about 3,000 thalers, a sum representing practically the savings of a lifetime. Bott had been leader of a small orchestra in Saxe-Meiningen as early as 1860, and was well advanced in years before he determined to seek his fortune in America. His wife was an elderly woman and they had no offspring. This violin, my husband, and myself made up the family. I loved it like a child, she testified at the trial. So also did Bott, the old musician, love his instrument, and no hand but his own was ever permitted to lift it from its case or dust its darkly glowing surface. Whatever may have been its owner's genius, he prospered little in the New World. And, although he labored conscientiously at his profession, the year 1894 found him still giving lessons upon the violin to only half a dozen pupils, and living in 2 rooms at 355 West 31st Street. But Bott, having the soul of a true musician, cared but little for money and was happy enough so long as he could smoke his old meerschaum pipe and draw the bow across the cherished violin, held lovingly to his cheek. Then hard times came a-knocking at the door. The meager account in the savings bank grew smaller and smaller. The landlord, the doctor and the grocer had to be paid. One night Bott laid down his pipe and, taking his wife's wrinkled hand in his, said gently, "Matilda, there is nothing else, we must sell our violin." "Even so," she answered, turning away her face that her husband might not see the tears. "As God wills." The next day the Duke of Cambridge Stradivarius was offered for sale by Victor S. Flechter, a friend of Bott's, who was a dealer in musical instruments at 23 Union Square. It so happened that Niccolini, the husband of Adelina Patti, was ambitious to own a genuine Stradivarius, and had been looking for one for a long time, and, although he was but an indifferent player, he had, in default of skill to perform, the money to buy. The matter was easily adjusted by Flechter, and Niccolini drew his check for the sum specified, which, properly certified, was tendered to Bott. But Bott had never seen a certified check and was unaccustomed to the ways of business. "If I part with my violin, I must have real money, money that I can feel, money that I can count. It was that kind of money that I paid for my violin," said he doggedly. Niccolini, in a rage, believing himself insulted, tore the check to bits and declared the transaction at an end. Now the price agreed upon for the violin had been $4,500, of which Flechter was to receive $500 as his commission, and when, through old Professor Bott's stubbornness, the sale fell through, the dealer was naturally very angry. Out of this incident grew the case against Flechter. The old musician was accustomed to leave his treasured instrument in the lowest drawer of his bureau at the boarding house. He always removed it before his pupils arrived and never put it back until their departure, thus ensuring the secrecy of its hiding place, and only his wife, his sister-in-law, Mollenhauer, a friend, and Cloten, a prospective purchaser, knew where it lay. On the morning of March 31, 1894, not long after the Niccolini incident, Bott gave a single lesson to a pupil at the boarding house, and after his midday meal, set out with his wife for Hoboken to visit a friend. The violin was left in its customary place. It was dark when they returned, and after throwing off his coat and lighting the gas, the old man hastened to make sure that his precious violin was safe. When he pulled out the drawer, it was empty. The Stradivarius was gone, with its leather case, its 2 bows and its wooden box. Half distracted, the musician and his wife searched everywhere in the room, in closets, under beds, even behind the curtains, before they could bring themselves to admit that the violin had in fact disappeared. Frantically Bott called for Ellen, the servant girl. Yes, there had been a caller, a young man with dark hair and a small, dark mustache, at about 5 o'clock. He had waited about half an hour, and then had said that he guessed he would go. She had not noticed that he took Anything away with him. In his despair the old man turned to his old friend Flechter, and the next day the dealer came to express his sympathy. He urged Bot to notify the police of the theft, but the old man was prostrate with grief. And it was the wife who, with Ellen Clancy, finally accompanied Flechter to police headquarters. The police had no idea who had taken the old fellow's fiddle, and did not particularly care anyway. Later they cared a good deal. Bot now began an endless and almost hopeless search for his beloved instrument, visiting every place where violins were sold, every pawn shop and second-hand store again and again until the proprietors began to think the old man must be crazy. Sometimes Flechter went with him. Once, the two traveled all the way over to New Jersey, but the scent proved to be a false one. Bot grew thinner and older week by week, almost day by day. When the professor did not feel equal to going outdoors, Mrs. Bot went for him, and on these occasions often called at Flechter's store to report progress, ask his advice and secure his encouragement. One day during one of these visits in the July following the loss of the violin, Flechter handed Mrs. Bot a sheet of paper, saying, "I have written something down here. If you have that printed and put a reward to it, you will get your violin back." The wording, partly printed and partly written in script, ran as follows: "Violin lost. $500 reward. No questions asked for return of instrument taken from residence of Jean Bot. March 31, 1894, 355 West 31st Street. Absolute safety and secrecy guaranteed. Victor S. Flechter, number 21 Union Square, violin maker and dealer." Mrs. Bot thanked him and took the notice away with her, but its publication had no result. The old professor began to fail. He no longer had an instrument upon which to teach his pupils, and those he could avail himself of seemed harsh and discordant. He had no appetite, and even found no solace in his pipe. Almost penniless, they were forced to give up their lodgings and move to Hoboken. Mrs. Bot still kept up the search, but the professor could no longer tramp the streets looking for his violin. He sat silent in his room, slowly, surely, dying of a broken heart. In course of time someone advised Mrs. Bot to lay her case before the district attorney, and accordingly, during the summer, she visited the criminal courts building and told her story to Colonel Allen, one of the assistants, who became greatly interested. The overwrought old woman had begun to suspect everybody, and even to accuse her husband's friend, Flechter, of a lack of any real interest. She thought he ought to be able to find the violin if he really made the effort. Allen began to take notice. The sleuth in him pricked up its ears. Why, sure. Certainly, Flechter was the one man who knew what Bot's violin was really worth, the one man who could sell it to advantage, and he had been done out of $500 by the old musician's stupidity. Allen thought he'd take a look into the thing. Now, there lived in the same boarding house with Allen a friend of his named Harry P. Durden, and to Durden Allen recounted the story of the lost violin and voiced his suspicions of Flechter. Durden entered enthusiastically into the case, volunteering to play the part of an amateur detective. Accordingly Durden, accompanied by a central office man named Baird, visited Flechter's place of business, and the two represented themselves as connoisseurs in violins and anxious to procure a genuine Strad for a certain Mr. Wright in St. Paul. Flechter expressed entire confidence in his ability to procure one, and did almost succeed in purchasing for them the so-called Jupiter Strad. All this took time, and at last, on April 28, 1895, poor old Bot died in his boarding house in Hoboken. After the funeral, the widow settled up her affairs, changing her boarding place temporarily, and, having no ties in this country, determined to return to end her days in the fatherland. On May 21 she wrote to Flechter, who had lost all track of her, that her husband had died, that she had moved to 306 River Street, Hoboken, and that she thought seriously of going back to Germany. 2 days later Flechter wrote the following letter to the Central Office man, who had given his name as Southan, an employee of the alleged Mr. Wright. Mr. Southan, care of H.P. Durden. Dear Sir, write to inform you that I have a genuine Strad to offer you and would like to see you at your earliest convenience. Very respectfully yours, Victor S. Flechter. When Allen saw this letter, it seemed to him absolutely to confirm his suspicions. Now that the only person in the world who had been authoritatively able to identify the Duke of Cambridge Stradivarius was dead, Flechter was offering one for sale. Then occurred the strangest thing of all. On May 28, 5 days after Flechter's letter to Southan, Mrs. Bott received the following extraordinary epistle. Like the notice given her by Flechter in his office, it was partly written in printed capitals, and partly in script. May 28, 1895. To Mrs. Bott, 306 River Street, Hoboken, N.J. Dear Madam, I wish to inform you that the violin taken from your house some time ago will be returned if you are willing to abide by agreements that will be made between you and I later on. It was my intention first to dispose of it, but on account of its great value and the danger it would place me in by offering for sale, being a violin maker and dealer and not being able to sell with safety for such a large sum of money, I concluded to wait. I have now thought the matter over and come to the conclusion that a little money is better than none, and if you are anxious for the return of the violin and willing to pay a sum of money, small compared with the value of the violin, I think we can make a deal. You can put a personal in the New York Sun saying I am willing to give a sum of money for the return of the violin. No questions asked. Mrs. J. Bott. When I see your personal in the Sun, I will let you know how the exchange can be made. Cave Dweller. This letter appeared to be written in a somewhat similar hand to that which penned the offer of the reward, which, according to Mrs. Bott, was Flechter's. By this time the widow and Allen were in close communication. The Cave Dweller letter, could it be shown to be in Flechter's penmanship, seemed to fix the crime on the violin dealer. Flechter's store is 2 flights up and looks out into Union Square. Before the window hangs a large gilded fiddle, and the walls are decorated with pictures of famous musicians. In the rear is a safe where the more valuable instruments are kept. In the front sits Flechter himself, a stoutish man of middle height, with white hair and mustache. But on June 23, 1895, Flechter was out when Durden and Baird called, and only his clerk and office boy were on hand. Durden wished, he said, to see the genuine Strad, about which Mr. Flechter had written him. The boy went to the safe and brought back a violin in a red silk bag. Inside was inscribed, Antonius Stradivarius Cremonis Facit Anno Domini 1725. The figures 17 were printed and the 25 written in ink. Durden examined it for some 15 minutes and noted certain markings upon it. On June 26 they called again, found Flechter in and asked to see the violin. This time the dealer looked at himself from the safe, and, at their request, carried it to 22 Gramercy Park, where Durden said he desired some experts to pass upon its genuineness. On the way over, Flechter guaranteed it to be a genuine Strad, and said it belonged to a retired merchant named Rossman, who would expect to get $4,000 for it. He himself would want $500, and Durden should have $500, so that they must not take less than $5,000. Once at Alan's boarding house, Flechter played upon the violin for Durden and the supposed Southan, and then the former asked to be allowed to take the instrument to a rear room and show it to a friend. Here Mrs. Bott, positively, identified the violin as that of her husband, clasping it to her bosom like a long-lost child. This was enough for Durden, who gave the instrument back to Flechter and caused his arrest as he was passing out of the front gate. The insulted dealer stormed and raged, but the car of Juggernaut had started upon its course, and that night Flechter was lodged in the city prison. Next morning he was brought before Magistrate Flammer in the Jefferson Market Police Court, and the violin was taken out of its case, which the police had sealed. At this, the first hearing in this extraordinary case, Mrs. Bott, of course, identified the violin positively as the Duke of Cambridge, and several other persons testified that, in substance, it was Bott's celebrated violin. But for the defendant, a number of violin makers swore that it was not the Bott violin at all, and more, that it was not even a Stradivarius. One of them, John J. Eller, to whom it will be necessary to revert later, made oath that the violin was his, stolen from him and brought to Flechter by the thief. On this testimony the magistrate naturally decided that the identity of the instrument had not been established and ordered that Flechter be discharged and the violin returned to him. Ordinarily that would have been the end of the case, but Allen had his own private views as to the guilt of the dealer, and on August 28 the grand jury filed an indictment against Flechter accusing him of feloniously receiving stolen property, the violin, knowing it to have been stolen. Great was Flechter's anger and chagrin, but he promptly gave bail and employed the ablest counsel he could afford. Now began the second act of this tragedy of errors. The case was called for trial. With the people's interests in the hands of James W. Osborne, just advancing into the limelight as a resourceful and relentless prosecutor. I say the people's case. But perhaps Allen's case would be a more fitting title. For the defense, Arthur W. Palmer held the fort, directing his fire upon Osborne and losing no advantage inadvertently given him. The noise of the conflict filled the courthouse and drowned the uproar on Broadway. Nightly and each morning the daily press gave columns to the proceedings. Every time the judge coughed, the important fact was given due prominence, and every jibe of counsel carried behind it its insignia of recognition. Laughter. It was one of those first great battles in which the professional value of compressed air as an explosive force and small pica type as projectiles was demonstrated. It was a combat of wind and leaden endurance contest during which the jury slept fitfully for 3 long weeks. 2 things, the prosecution claimed, proved Flechter's guilt. First, the fact that the violin found in his possession was the Duke of Cambridge. Second, that the cave dweller letter was in the same handwriting as Flechter's notice of reward. Of course the latter proposition carried with it the necessity of proving in the first place that the notice itself was in Flechter's penmanship. Flechter, through his counsel, said it wasn't, and that he had never told Mrs. Bott that it was. He claimed that his brother-in-law, John D. Abraham, had written it. Mrs. Bott, he alleged, was an old lady and was mistaken in her testimony when she swore that he had said, "I have written down something." He had not said so. Mr. Abraham corroborated him. He had written it himself sitting in an armchair, all but the words 355 West 31st Street, which had been put in by a certain M.R. Jopling who had been present. Mr. Jopling swore that that was so, too. But, On cross-examination, it developed that Mr. Abraham had been practicing making copies of the notice at the suggestion of the lawyer for the defense, and, when Mr. Jopling took the stand, he was called upon to explain an affidavit made by him for Assistant District Attorney Allen, in which he affirmed that he did not know who wrote the words 355 West 31st Street. His explanation did not explain, and, anyhow, there did not seem to be any particular reason why Abraham and Jopling should have written Flechter's notice for him. Besides, even if Flechter did not write it and Abraham did, it would still remain almost as bad for Flechter if it was shown that cave dweller was his own brother-in-law. But Mrs. Bott was a woman who appealed strongly to a jury's sympathies, and she was clear that Flechter had said that he had written the notice. Moreover, she recalled that the date had first been written May and that Flechter had erased it and inserted March in its place. A microscopic examination revealed the fact that such an erasure had been made. When the smoke cleared, the credibility of the defense appeared badly damaged. But the precise point was of little importance. After all, the great question was the identity of cave dweller. On this point, a number of witnesses testified from a general knowledge of Flechter's handwriting that the cave dweller letter was his, and three well-known handwriting experts, Dr. Percival Fraser, Mr. Daniel T. Ames and Mr. David Carvalho, swore that, in their opinion, the same hand had written it that had penned the notice. It is not unlikely that Flechter's fear of a conviction led him to invite testimony in his behalf which would not bear the test of careful scrutiny. Many an innocent man has paid the penalty for uncommitted crime because he has sought to bolster up his defense with doubtful evidence without the incubus of which he would have been acquitted. Naturally, the chief point against Flechter, if it could be established, was his actual possession of the Bott Stradivarius when he was arrested. Upon this proposition, Mrs. Bott was absolutely positive beyond the possibility of error. So were 8 other witnesses for the prosecution. Then the defense produced a violin alleged to be the same one exhibited in the police court and brought by Flechter to Durden's house, and asked Mrs. Bott and her witnesses what they thought of it. Mrs. Bott could not identify it, but she swore no less positively that it was an entirely different violin from the one which she had seen before the magistrate. Then Osborne hurled his bomb over his enemy's parapet and cried loudly that a monstrous wicked fraud had been perpetrated to thwart justice, that the defense had faked another violin and were now trying to foist the bogus thing in evidence to deceive the court. 10 witnesses for the prosecution now swore that the violin so produced was not the one which Flechter had tried to sell Durden. Of course, it would have been comparatively easy to fake a violin, just as Osborne claimed, and the case shed some light upon the possibilities of the old violin industry. The star witness for the prosecution to prove that the instrument produced in the police court was the Bott violin was August M. Gamunder, and his testimony upon the trial before Recorder Goff is worthy of careful examination, since the jury considered it of great importance in reaching a verdict, even requesting that it should be reread to them some hours after retiring to deliberate. Gamunder testified, in substance, that he belonged to a family which had been making violins for 3 generations and had himself been making them for 20 years, that he was familiar with Bott's Stradivarius, having seen it 3 times, and that he firmly believed a large part of the violin produced before the magistrate was the missing Bott, certainly the back and scroll. Moreover, he was able to describe the markings of the Bott violin even to the label inside it. It should be mentioned, however, that in the magistrate's court he had been called only to describe the Bott violin and not to identify the one produced as the Bott itself. He further swore that the violin now offered by the defense on the trial was not the one in evidence before the magistrate, but was one which he had sold some years before to one Charles Palm. The defense, on the other hand, called among its witnesses John P. Frederick, a violin maker, who testified that he was familiar with the Bott's Strad and had seen it in 1873 at Bott's house, Grenescher Castle, in Germany, that he had repaired it in this country in 1885, that the instrument in court was not a Strad, nor even a good imitation of one, and, of course, was not the Duke of Cambridge, but that it was the identical instrument produced before the magistrate, and one which he recognized as having been sent him for repair by Charles Palm in 1885. Thus both sides agreed that the fiddle now offered in evidence was a bogus Strad, once belonging to a man named Palm, the only element of conflict being as to whether or not the violin which Flechter had offered for sale was the Palm instrument, or, in fact, Bott's famous Duke of Cambridge. All this technical testimony about violins and violin structure naturally bored the jury almost to extinction, and even the bitter personal encounters of counsel did not serve to relieve the dreariness of the trial. One oasis of humor in this desert of dry evidence gave them passing refreshment, when a picturesque witness for the defense, an instrument maker named Franz Bruckner, from South Germany, having been asked if the violin shown him was a Strad, replied, with a grunt of disgust, "Ach Himmel, nein." Being then invited to describe all the characteristics of genuine Stradivarius workmanship, he tore his hair and, with an expression of utter hopelessness upon his wrinkled face, exclaimed despairingly to the interpreter, "Doctor, if I gave you lessons in this every day for 3 weeks you would know no more than you do now." An answer which was probably true, and equally so of the jury, who were shouldered with the almost impossible task of determining from this mass of conflicting opinion just where the truth really lay. The chief witness for the defense was John J. Eller, who testified that he had been a musician for 30 years and a collector of violins, that the violin in court was the same one produced before the magistrate, and was not Bott's, but his own, that he had first seen it in the possession of Charles Palm in 1886 in his house in 8th Street and St. Mark's Place, New York City, had borrowed it from Palm and played on it for 2 months in Seabright, and had finally purchased it from Palm in 1891, and continued to play in concerts upon it, until, having been loaned by him to a music teacher named Perotti, in 23rd Street, it was stolen by the latter and sold to Flechter. It appeared that Eller had at once brought suit against Flechter for the possession of the instrument, which suit, he asserted, he was still pressing in the courts, and he now declared that the violin was in exactly the same condition in every respect as when produced in the police court, although it had been changed in some respects since it had been stolen. It had originally been made of baked wood by one Dedier Nicholas, an instrument maker of the first half of the 19th century, and stamped with the maker's name, but this inscription was now covered by a Stradivarius label. Eller scornfully pointed out that no Strad had ever been made of baked wood, and showed the jury certain pegs used by no other maker than Nicholas, and certain marks worn upon the instrument by his, the witness, own playing. He also exhibited the check with which he had paid for it. In support of this evidence, Charles Palm himself was called by the defense and identified the violin as one which he had bought some 12 years before for $15 or $20 and later sold to Eller. Upon the question of the identity of the instrument then lying before the jury, this evidence was conclusive, but, of course, it did not satisfy the jury as to whether Flechter had tried to sell the Palm violin or Bott's violin to Durden. Unfortunately, Eller's evidence threw aside light on the defense, without which the trial might well have resulted in an acquittal. Eller had sworn that he was still vigorously endeavoring to get the palm violin back from Flechter, as contradicting him in this respect, and as tending to show that the suit had not only been compromised but that he and Flechter were engaged in trying to put off the palm violin as a genuine Stradivarius and share the profit of the fraud. The prosecution introduced the following letter from the witness to his lawyer. Clifton House, Chicago, Illinois. March 23, 1896. Dear Counselor, received your letter just now. I have been expecting Mr. Flechter's lawyer would settle with you. He got $900 for the violin and Mr. Meyer arranged with myself for the half, $450, which he proposed himself, and have been expecting a settlement on their part long ago. I have assisted Mr. Palmer, his able lawyer, with the best of my ability, and have covered Mr. Flechter's shortcomings of faking the violin to Estrad. Yours most sincerely, John Eller. Metropolitan Opera Co., Chicago, Ill. From this letter it was fairly inferable that although the defendant might be innocent of the precise crime with which he was charged, he was, nevertheless, upon his own evidence, guilty of having faked a cheap Nicholas violin into a Strad, and of having offered it for sale for the exorbitant price of $5,000. This luckless piece of evidence undoubtedly influenced the jury to convict him. It will be recalled that 10 witnesses for the prosecution had sworn that the violin offered in evidence at the trial was not the one produced in the police court, as against the defendant's 5 who asserted that it was. The testimony was all highly technical and confusing, and the jury probably relied more upon their general impressions of the credibility of the witnesses than upon anything else. It is likely that most of the testimony, on both sides, in regard to the identity of the violin was honestly given, for the question was one upon which a genuine divergence of opinion was easily possible. Eller's letter from Chicago so affected the jury that they disregarded his testimony and reverted to that of August Gemunder, to whose evidence attention has already been called, and who swore that it was the Duke of Cambridge, which Flechter had tried to sell to Durden. Alas for the fallibility of even the most honest of witnesses. The case was ably argued by both sides, and every phase of this curious tangle of evidence given its due consideration. The defense very properly laid stress upon the fact that it would have been a ridiculous performance for Flechter to write the cave dweller letter and state therein that he was a violin dealer or maker, thus pointing, unmistakably, to himself, and to further state that for one in his position to dispose of it would be difficult and dangerous. The only explanation for the cave dweller letter which they could offer, however, was that some one interested in procuring Flechter's downfall had caused it to be sent for that purpose. This might either be a business rival or someone connected with the prosecution. While Palmer was summing up for the defense, he noticed Assistant District Attorney Allen smiling and dramatically turning upon him. He shouted, "This is no laughing matter, Colonel Allen. It is a very serious matter whether this man is to be allowed tonight to go home and kiss his little ones, or whether he is to be cast into jail because you used your brains to concoct a theory against him." Another consideration, which seemed deserving of weight, was that if Flechter did steal the Duke of Cambridge, it would have been a piece of incredible folly and carelessness upon his part to leave it in such an exposed place as the safe of his store, where it could be found by the police or shown by the officeboy to anyone who called. Yet the positive identification of August Gemunder and the fatal disclosures of Eller, coupled with the vehement insistence of the prosecution, led the jury to resolve what doubt they had in the case against the prisoner, and, after Deliberating 8 or 10 hours and being out all night, they returned a verdict of guilty. Flechter broke down and declared bitterly that he was the victim of a conspiracy upon the part of his enemies, assisted by a too credulous prosecuting attorney. Everybody admitted that it was an extraordinary case, but the press was consistent in its clamor against Flechter, and opinion generally was that he had been rightly convicted. On May 22 he was sentenced to the penitentiary for 12 months, but, after being incarcerated in the Tombs for 3 weeks, he secured a certificate of reasonable doubt and a stay until his conviction could be reviewed on appeal. Then he gave bail and was released. But he had been in jail. Flechter will never forget that. And, for the time being at least, his reputation was gone, his family disgraced, and his business ruined. A calm reading of the record of the trial suggests that the case abounded in doubts more or less reasonable, and that the court might well have taken it from the jury on that account. But a printed page of questions and answers carries with it no more than a suggestion of the value of testimony, the real significance of which lies in the manner in which it is given, the tone of the voice and the flash of the eye. Once again Flechter sat at his desk in the window behind the great gilded fiddle. To him, as to its owner, the great Stradivarius had brought only sorrow. But for him the world had no pity. Surely the strains of this wonderful instrument must have had a dying fall even when played by the loving hand of old Jean Bott. At last, after several years, in 1899, the case came up in the appellate division of the Supreme Court. Flechter had been led to believe that his conviction would undoubtedly be reversed and a new trial ordered, which would be tantamount to an acquittal, for it was hardly likely in such an event that a second trial would be considered advisable upon the same evidence. But to his great disappointment, his conviction was sustained by a divided court, in which only 2 of the 5 justices voted for a new trial. Again fortune had averted her face. If only one more judge had thought the evidence insufficient. The great gilded fiddle seemed to Flechter an omen of misfortune. Once more he gave bail, this time in $5,000, and was set at liberty pending his appeal to the highest court in the state. Once more he took his seat in his office and tried to carry on his business. But time had dragged on. People had forgotten all about Flechter and the lost Stradivarius, and when his conviction was affirmed little notice was taken of the fact. It was generally assumed that having been sentenced he was in jail. Then something happened which once more dragged Flechter into the limelight. Editors rushed to their files and dusted the cobwebs off the issues containing the accounts of the trial. The sign of the gilded fiddle became the daily center of a throng of excited musicians, lawyers, and reporters. The lost Stradivarius, the great Duke of Cambridge, the nemesis of Bott and of Flechter, was found by Flechter himself, as he claimed, on August 17, 1900. According to the dealer and his witnesses, the amazing discovery occurred in this wise. A violin maker named Joseph Farr, who at one time had worked for Flechter and had testified in his behalf at the trial, to the effect that the instrument produced in the police court was not Bott's Stradivarius, saw by chance a very fine violin in the possession of a family named Springer in Brooklyn, and notified Flechter of the fact. The latter, who was always ready to purchase choice violins, after vainly trying for a long time to induce the Springers to bring it to New York, called with Farr upon Mrs. Springer and asked to examine it. To his utter astonishment, she produced for his inspection Bott's long-lost Stradivarius. Hardly able to control his excitement, Flechter immediately returned to New York and reported the discovery to the police, who instantly began a thorough examination of the circumstances surrounding its discovery. The district attorney's office and the detective bureau were at first highly suspicious of this opportune discovery on the part of a convicted felon of the precise evidence necessary to clear him, but it was soon demonstrated to their pretty general satisfaction that the famous Stradivarius had in fact been pawned in the shop of one Benjamin Fox on the very day and within an hour of the theft, together with its case and two bows, for the insignificant sum of $4. After the legal period of redemption had expired, it had been put up at auction and bid in by the pawnbroker for a small advance over the sum for which it had been pawned. It lay exposed for purchase on Fox's shelf for some months, until, in December 1895, a tailor named James Dooley visited the shop to redeem a silver watch. Being, at the same time, in funds, and able to satisfy his taste as a virtuoso, he felt the need of and bought a violin for $10, but, Fox urging upon him the desirability of getting a good one while he was about it, was finally persuaded to purchase the bought violin for $20 in its stead. Dooley took it home, played upon it as the spirit moved, and whenever in need of ready money brought it back to Fox as security, always redeeming it in time to prevent its sale. One day, being at Mrs. Springer's, where he was accustomed to purchase tailor trimmings, he offered it to her for sale, and, as her son was taking violin lessons, induced her to buy it for $30. And in the house of the Springers it had quietly remained ever since, while lawyers and prosecutors wrangled and thundered and witnesses swore positively to the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, to prove that Flechter stole the violin and tried to sell it to Durden. On these facts, which did not seem to admit of contradiction, Recorder Goff ordered an oral examination of all the witnesses, the hearing of which, sandwiched in between the current trials in his court, dragged along for months, but which finally resulted in establishing to the court's satisfaction that the violin discovered in the possession of the Springers was the genuine Duke of Cambridge, and that it could not have been in Flechter's possession at the time he was arrested. On July 7, 1902, 8 years after Bott's death and the arrest and indictment of Flechter for the theft of the violin, a picturesque group assembled in the General Sessions. There was Flechter and his lawyer, Mrs. Springer, and her son, the attorneys for the prosecution, and lastly old Mrs. Bott. The seals of the case were broken and the violin identified by the widow as that of her husband. The Springers waived all claim to the violin, and the court dismissed the indictment against the defendant and ordered the Stradivarius to be delivered to Mrs. Bott, with these words: "Mrs. Bott, it affords very great pleasure to the court to give the violin to you. You have suffered many years of sorrow and trouble in regard to it." 8 years, sighed the old lady, clasping the violin in her arms. "I wish you a great deal of pleasure in its possession," continued the recorder. Thus ended, as a matter of record, the case of the people against Flechter. For 8 years the violin dealer and his family had endured the agony of disgrace. He had spent a fortune in his defense, and had nevertheless been convicted of a crime of which he was at last proved innocent. Yet, there are those who, when the case is mentioned, shake their heads wisely, as if to say that the whole story of the lost Stradivarius has never been told. Story 14. The Typewriter's Confession. The estate sale smelled of mothballs and regret when antique dealer Jacob Whitlock first saw the 1937 Underwood typewriter. Its keys were yellowed with age, but the ribbon was fresh, too fresh for an object that hadn't been used in decades. First click. Jacob tested the typewriter in his shop that night. The E-key stuck. As he walked away to get oil, 3 sharp clicks echoed through the empty store. When he returned, the paper read: Emma Grace Wilcox, missing since October 17, 1983, check the well. The police report confirmed it. Emma Wilcox had vanished after school in '83. They'd searched the old Henderson well but found nothing. Until Jacob showed them where to dig. The list grows. Over the next week, the typewriter produced. Daniel Ruiz, 1991, bones found where it specified beneath an oak tree. Cyril Yang, 1978, class ring discovered in a drainage pipe. Thomas O'Connell, 1989, remains located behind a false wall in his childhood home. Each victim had disappeared within 20 miles of Jacob's shop. Each name appeared in perfect chronological order. Each typed with distinct pressure patterns as if different hands had used the machine. The breakthrough. Jacob found a connection in newspaper archives. All the missing persons had last been seen near the Red Quill bookshop, owned by Luther Graves from 1965 to 2003. Graves had been questioned but never charged. His typewriter printed alibis were always ironclad. The shop's inventory included one 1937 Underwood typewriter, sold in 2004 estate sale. 37 first edition crime novels, each about missing persons. A ledger with coded entries matching the victims' disappearance dates. The final message. At 3:17 a.m., the typewriter sprang to life while Jacob watched. Luther Graves, 2003, look under the keys. Beneath the typewriter's mechanism, Jacob found a child's tooth wedged near the M key. Fingerprint smudges in dried ink, matched to multiple victims. A tiny scroll reading, "They live in the words now." The shop's secret. The abandoned Red Quill bookshop's basement revealed. A wall of handwritten stories describing each disappearance. A collection of personal items arranged like museum exhibits. Luther's final journal entry. The typewriter remembers everything. When you press a key, it keeps part of you forever. I've made them immortal. Now who will tell my story? Epilogue. The typewriter sits in evidence lockup. But guards report clicking noises at night. Fresh names appearing on blank paper. Ink fingerprints that match no living person. Jacob keeps one souvenir, a single keycap Luther had hidden in his journal. The M key. For missing. Story 15. The House with Secrets. The listing for 47 Blackwood Lane promised a grand Victorian mansion with original charm. But as real estate agent Claire Mercer stepped through the creaking front door, her clipboard trembled in her hands. The blueprints from the county records showed 12 rooms. The house had 13. The first showing. Claire's laser measure gave conflicting readings in the master bedroom. The west wall was 6 inches too shallow, just enough space for something. Her first potential buyers, the Wilkersons, never showed up for their afternoon appointment. When Claire called, Mrs. Wilkerson sounded confused. "We cancelled yesterday. Some man called saying you'd moved the showing." No one at her office had made that call. The missing room. That night, Claire spread the original 1891 architect's plans across her kitchen table. The differences were subtle but chilling. The pantry was 2 feet narrower in reality. The staircase had 1 extra step. The third-floor hallway extended further than the plans showed. Most disturbing was the small rectangular space between the library and dining room, a room that didn't exist when she'd toured the house. The wall that wasn't there. At 3:17 a.m., Claire's phone buzzed with an alert. The motion sensors at 47 Blackwood had been triggered. The security feed showed static for exactly 47 seconds. A shadow moving through the library. Then a door appearing where solid wall should be. When Claire arrived, she found fresh scratches around the library's baseboards. The scent of cedar and wet earth. A child's marble rolling from nowhere across the floor. The house's history. The Historical Society's records revealed. The original owner, Silas Blackwood, was a taxidermist. In 1903, his entire family vanished over one weekend. The police report noted discrepancies in room dimensions. The house had 37 different owners in 120 years, none stayed more than a year. The final showing. Claire returned with a sledgehammer. The library wall gave way too easily, revealing a hidden study with walls covered in strange equations. Glass jars containing what looked like animal organs, but weren't. A small desk with a ledger labeled Specimen Catalog. The last entry read: "Final experiment successful. The house remembers now. It will keep adding rooms until..." The sentence ended mid-word. Epilogue. 47, Blackwood Lane was condemned. But Claire keeps finding blueprints in her office that change overnight. Voices on her showing recordings that no one heard live. Fresh dirt on her shoes after walking barefoot floors. The new listing just went live. It now shows 14 rooms.